Chapter 11 of The Little Colonel in Arizona. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Little Colonel in Arizona by Annie Fellows Johnston. Chapter 11. The New Boarder at Lee's Ranch. Mary could hardly wait to tell the news to Phil and Mrs. Lee. She ran nearly all the way from the wigwam to the ranch, her hat in her hand and the lid of her lunch basket flapping. Long before she came within calling distance, she saw Phil mount his horse out by the pasture bars and ride slowly along the driveway which led past the tents to the public road. With the hope of intercepting him, she dashed on still more wildly, but her shoestring tripped her, and she was obliged to stop to tie them. Glancing up as she jerked them into hard knots, she breathed a sigh of relief, for he had drawn rein to speak to Mr. Ellestad and the new boarder, who were sitting in the sun near the bamboo arbor. Then, just as he was about to start on again, Mrs. Lee came singing out to the tents with an armful of clean towels, and he called to her some question, which brought her laughing to join the group. Thankful for these two delays, Mary went dashing on toward them, so breathlessly that Phil gave a whistle of surprise as she turned in at the ranch. "What's the matter, Mary?" he called. "Indians after you again?" "No," she panted, throwing herself down on the dry Bermuda grass, and wiping her flushed face on her sleeve. "I'm on my way to school. I just stopped by with a message, and I thought you'd like to hear the news." "Well, that depends," began Phil teasingly. "We hear so little out on this lonely desert that our systems may not be able to stand the shock of anything exciting. If it's good news, maybe we can bear it if you break it to us gently. If it's bad, you'd better not run any risks. Where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise, you know." "Oh, come now, Tremont, that's too bad," laughed Mr. Ellestad. "Don't head her off that way when she's in such a hurry to tell it." "Then go on, Mary," said Phil, gravely. "Mr. Ellestad's curiosity is greater than his caution, and Mr. Armond hasn't been in the desert long enough to be affected by its dearth of news. So anything sudden can't hurt him. Go on." Mary stole a glance at the new boarder. The long, slender fingers, smoothing his closely clipped, pointed beard, hid the half smile that lurked around his mouth. He was leaning back in his camp chair, apparently so little interested in his surroundings that Mary felt that his presence need not be taken into account any more than the bamboo arbors. "Well," she said, as if announcing something of national importance, "Joyce has an order." "An order?" repeated Phil. "What under the canopy is that? Is it catching?" "Don't pay any attention to him, Mary," Mr. Ellestad hastened to say, seeing a little distressed pucker between her eyes. "Phil is a trifle slow to understand, but he wants to hear just as much as we do." "Well, it's an order to paint some cards," explained Mary, speaking very slowly and distinctly in her effort to make the matter clear to him. "You know the Links back in Plainsville, Mrs. Lee. You've heard me talk about Grace Link ever so many times. Her cousin Cecilia is to be married soon, and her bridesmaids are all to be girls that she studied music with at the Boston Conservatory. So her Aunt Sue, that's Mrs. Link, is going to give her a bridal musical. It's to be the finest entertainment that ever was in Plainsville, and they want Joyce to decorate the souvenir programs. Once she painted some place cards for a Valentine dinner that Mrs. Link gave. She did that for nothing, but Mrs. Link has sent her $10 in advance for making only 30 programs. That's 30 cents apiece. They're to have cupids and garlands of roses and strings of hearts on 'em, no two alike, and bars of music from the wedding marches and bridal chorus. Joyce is the happiest thing. She's nearly wild over it. She's so pleased. She's going to buy a hive of bees with the money." Phil groaned, but Mary paid no attention to the interruption. "The letter and the package of blank cards for the programs came this morning while she was sweeping, and she just left the dirt and the broom right in the middle of the floor and sat down on the doorstep and began sketching little designs on the back of the envelope as they popped into her head. Lloyd and Jack and mamma are going to do all the cooking and housework and everything, so Joyce can spend all her time on the cards. They want them right away. Isn't that splendid?" "Whoop-la!" exclaimed Phil, as Mary stopped out of breath. "Fortune has at last changed in your favor. I'll ride straight up to the Wigwam to congratulate her." "Oh, I almost forgot what I stopped by for!" exclaimed Mary. "Lloyd told me to tell you that you needn't come to day to take her riding, for she'll be too busy helping Joyce to go." Phil scowled. "The turn in my fortune isn't so favourable, it seems. Well, if I'm not wanted at the Wigwam, I'll go to town to day. There's always something doing in Phoenix. Climb up behind me, Mary, and I'll give you a lift as far as the schoolhouse." As they galloped gaily down the road, Mrs. Lee looked after them with a troubled expression in her eyes. "There's too much doing in Phoenix for a nice boy like that," she thought. "I wish he wouldn't go so often. I must tell him the experience some of my other boys have had when they went in with idle hands and full purses like his." Her boarders were always her boys to Mrs. Lee, and she watched over them with motherly interest, not only nursing them in illness and cheering them in homesickness, but many a time whispering a warning against the temptations which beset all exiles from home, who have nothing to do but kill time. Now, with the hope of interesting the new boarder in something beside himself, she dropped down into the rustic seat near him, hanging the towels over the arm of it while she talked. "You must make the acquaintance of the Wares, Mr. Armond," she began. "They stayed at the ranch 3 weeks, and this little Mary and her brothers kept things humming the whole time." "They'd give me nervous prostration in half a day if they're all like that little chatterbox," he answered, listlessly. "Not Joyce," interrupted Mr. Ellestad. "She's the most interesting child of her age I ever knew, and, being an artist yourself, you couldn't fail to be interested in her unbounded ambition. She really has talent, I think. For a girl of 15, her clever little water colours and her pen and ink work show unusual promise." "Then I'm sorry for her," said Mr. Armond. "If she has ambition and thinks she has talent, life will be twice as hard for her. Always a struggle, always an unsatisfied groping after something she can never reach." "But I believe that she will reach what she wants some day," was the reply. "She has youth and health and unbounded hope. The other day I quoted an old Norwegian proverb, 'He waits not long who waits for a feast.' She wrote it on the kitchen door, saying, 'I'll have to wait till I can earn enough money to buy one hive of bees, and then I'll wait for that hive to swarm, and make another, and for the two to grow into 100, and that into 200 maybe, before I'll have enough to go away and study. It'll be years and years before I reach the mark I've set for myself, but when I'm really an artist, doing the things I've dreamed of doing, that will be a feast worth any amount of waiting.' Now, in less than a week she has found her way to the first step, the first hive of bees, and I'm truly glad for her." "But the happier such beginnings, the more tragic the end oftentimes," Mr. Armond answered. "I've known such cases, scores of them, when I was an art student myself in Paris. Girls and young fellows who thought they were budding geniuses, who left home and country and everything else for art's sake. They lived in garrets and slaved and struggled and starved on for years, only to find in the end that they were not geniuses, only to face failure. I never encourage beginners any more. For what is more cruel than to say to some hungry soul, 'Go on, wait, you'll reach the feast, your longing shall be satisfied,' when you know full well that in only one case in 10,000, perhaps, can there be a feast for one of them. that when they stretch out their hands for bread there will be only a stone." "But you reached it yourself, Pharmon, you know you did," answered Mr. Ellestad, who had known the new boarder well in his younger days. "To have had pictures sung in the Salon and Academy, to be recognized as a success in both hemispheres, isn't that enough of a feast to satisfy most men?" The face turned to him in reply wore the look of one who has fought the bitterest of fights and fallen vanquished. "No. To have a sweet snatched away just as it is placed to one's lips is worse than never to have tasted it. What good does it do me now? Look at me, a hopeless invalid doomed to a year or two of unendurable idleness. How much easier it would be for me now to fold my hands and wait, if I had no baffled ambitions to torment me hourly, no higher desires in life than Chris there." He pointed to the swarthy Mexican digging a ditch across the alfalfa pasture. "No," he repeated, "I'd never encourage any one, now, to start on such an unsatisfactory quest." "I'm sorry," said Mr. Ellestad. "When I heard that you were coming, I hoped that you would take an interest in Joyce Ware. You could be the greatest inspiration and help to her if you only would." "There she is now!" exclaimed Mrs. Lee, who sat facing the road. "It does me good to see any one swing along as she does, with so much energy and purpose in every movement." Mr. Armond turned his head slightly for a view of the girlish figure moving rapidly toward them. "Don't tell her that I'm an artist, Ellestad," he said, hurriedly, as she drew near, "or that I've ever lived in the Latin Quarter, or anything like that. I know how schoolgirls gush over such things, and I'm in no mood for callow enthusiasms." Joyce's errand was to borrow some music, the wedding marches, if Mrs. Lee had them, from Lohengrin and Tannhäuser. She remembered seeing several old music books on the organ in the adobe parlor, and she thought maybe the selections she wanted might be in them. Mr. Armond sat listening to the conversation with as little interest, apparently, as he had done to Mary's. After acknowledging his introduction to Joyce by a grave bow, he leaned back in his chair and seemed to withdraw himself from notice. At first glance Joyce had been a trifle embarrassed by the presence of this distinguished-looking stranger. Something about him, the cut of the short pointed beard, the nervous movement of his long, sensitive fingers, the eyes that seemed to see so much and so deeply in their brief glances, recalled some memory, vague and disturbing. She tried to remember where it was she had seen some man who looked like this one. "Is it very necessary that you should have the wedding marches?" asked Mrs. Lee, coming back from a fruitless search in the parlor. "Wouldn't a few bars from any other music do just as well? So long as you have some notes, I should think any other march would carry out the idea just as well." "No," said Joyce. "All the guests will be musicians. They'd see at a glance if it wasn't appropriate, and ordinary music would not mean anything in such a place." "I know where you can get what you want," said Mrs. Lee, "but you'd have to go to Phoenix for it. I have a friend there who is a music teacher and an organist. I'll give you a note to her, if you care enough to go 6 miles." "Oh, thank you, Mrs. Lee!" cried Joyce. "I'll be glad to take it, if it isn't too much trouble for you to write it. I'd go 20 miles rather than not have the right notes on the programs." Mr. Armond darted a quick glance at her through half-closed eyelids. Evidently she was more in earnest than he had supposed. As Mrs. Lee went to the house to write the note, Mr. Ellestad said, smilingly, "Mary told us that this piece of good fortune will bring you your first hive of bees, give you your first step toward the city of your desire. It seems appropriate that this bridal musical should give you your hives. Did you ever hear that the bow of the Hindu love god is supposed to be strung with wild bees?" "No," she answered, slowly. "But it's a pretty idea, isn't it?" Then her face lighted up so brightly that Mr. Armond looked at her with awakening interest. "Oh, I'm so glad you told me that. It suggests such a pretty design. See, I can make one card like this." Taking a pencil from her hair, where she had thrust it when she started on her errand, and catching up the old music book Mrs. Lee had brought out, she began sketching rapidly on a fly leaf. "I'll have a little Cupid in this corner, his bow strung with tiny bees, shooting across this staff of music, suspended from two hearts. And instead of notes, I'll make bees flying up and down between the lines. Won't that be fine?" Mr. Armond nodded favorably when the sketch was passed to him. "Very good," he said, looking at it critically. Slipping a pencil from his pocket, he held it an instant over the little fat Cupid, as if to make some correction or suggestion. But apparently changing his mind, he passed the sketch back to Joyce without a word. Again she was baffled by that vague half memory. The gesture with which he had taken the pencil from his pocket and replaced it seemed familiar. The critical turn of his head, as he looked at the sketch, was certainly like some one's she knew. She liked him, in spite of his indifference. Something in his refined, melancholy face made her feel sorry for him, sorrier than she had been for any of the other people at the ranch. He looked white and ill, and the spells of coughing that seized him now and then seemed to leave him exhausted. When Mrs. Lee came out with the note, Joyce rose to go. She had learned in the short conversation with Mr. Ellestad that this stranger was an old acquaintance of his, so she said hospitably, "We are your nearest neighbours, Mr. Armond. I know from experience how monotonous the desert is till one gets used to it. Whenever you feel in need of a change, we'll be glad to see you at the Wigwam. It's always lively there now." He thanked her gravely, and Mr. Ellestad added, with a laugh, "He's just at the point now where Shapur was when the caravan went on without him. He doesn't think that these arid sands can hold anything worth while." "Oh, I know!" exclaimed Joyce, with an understanding note in her voice. "It's dreadful until you follow the bee and find your Omar. You must tell him about it, Mr. Ellestad." Then she hurried away. Half an hour later she galloped by on the pony toward Phoenix. Lloyd was riding beside her. As they passed the ranch, she waved a greeting with the note which Mrs. Lee had given her. "What do you think of her work?" asked Mr. Ellestad of his friend. "One couldn't judge from a crude outline like that," was the answer. "She is so young that it is bound to be amateurish. Still, she certainly shows originality, and she has a capacity for hard work. Her willingness to go all the way to Phoenix for a few bars of music shows that she has the right stuff in her, but I wouldn't encourage her if I were in your place." When Mr. Ellestad called at the Wigwam that afternoon, he found Joyce hard at work. A row of finished programs was already stretched out on the table before her. Through the door that opened into the kitchen, he could see Lloyd at the ironing board. Her face was flushed, and there was an anxious little frown between her eyes, because the wrinkles wouldn't come out of the sheets, and the hot irons had scorched 2 towels in succession. But she rubbed away with dogged persistence, determined to finish all that was left in the basket, despite Joyce pleading that she should stop. "Those things can wait till the last of the week just as well as not," she insisted. But Lloyd was unyielding. "No, sir," she declared. "I nevah had a chance to iron even a pocket handkerchief befo', and I'm bound I'll do it, now I've begun." There was a blister on one pink little palm, and a long red burn on the back of her hand, but she kept cheerfully on until the basket was empty. "Tell me about Mr. Armond," said Joyce, as she worked. "He reminds me of some one I've seen. I've been trying all afternoon to think. You've known him a long time, haven't you?" "Yes, I met him abroad when he was a mere boy," answered Mr. Ellestad. wishing that he had not been asked to say nothing about his friend's career as an artist. The tale of his experiences and successes would have been of absorbing interest to Joyce. "Armand doesn't like to have his past discussed," he said after a pause. "He made a brilliant success of it until his health failed several years ago. Since then he has grown so morose that he is not like the same creature. He has lost faith in everything. I tell him that if he would rouse himself to take some interest in people and things about him, if he'd even read, and get his mind off of himself, then he'd quit cursing the day he was born, and pick up a little appetite. Then he would live longer. If he were at some sanitarium, they'd make him eat. But here he won't go to the table half the time. Joe fixes up all sorts of tempting extras for him, but he just looks at them and shoves them aside without tasting. The only thing I have heard him express a wish for since he has been at the Grange is quail." "Oh, we're going to have some for supper to night," cried Joyce. "Jack shot 7 yesterday. He gets some nearly every day. I'll send Mr. Armond one if you think he'd like it. That is, if they turn out all right. My cooking isn't always a success, especially when my mind is on something like this work." Everybody in the family helped to get supper that night, even Norman, so that Joyce might work on undisturbed till the last moment. The only part that she took in the preparations was to superintend the cooking of the quail, and to call out directions to the others, as she painted garlands of roses and sprays of orange blossoms on one programme after another. "Spread one of the white fringed napkins out in the little brown covered basket, Mary, please, and put in a knife and fork. And Lloyd, I wish you'd set a saucer on the stove hearth where it'll get almost red hot. Jack, if you'll have the pony ready at the door, I'll fly down to Mr. Armond with the quail the minute they are done, so that he'll get it piping hot. No, I'll take it myself, thank you. You boys are as hungry as bears, and I've painted so hard all afternoon that I haven't a bit of appetite. I'll feel more like eating if I have the ride first." The ranch supper bell was ringing as she started down the road on a gallop, holding the basket carefully in one hand and guiding the pony with the other. Everybody had gone into the dining room but Mr. Armond. Wrapped in a steamer rug and overcoat, he sat just outside the door of his tent, his hat pulled down over his eyes. Turning from the driveway, she rode directly across the lawn toward him. She was bareheaded, and her face was glowing, not only from the rapid ride, but the kindly impulse that prompted her coming. He looked up in astonishment as she leaned over to offer him the little basket. "I've brought you quail, Mr. Armond," she said, breathlessly. "You must eat it quick, while it's blazing hot, and eat it every bit but the bones, for it was cooked on purpose for you. It'll do you good." Without an instant's pause, she started off again, but he called her. "Wait a moment, child. I haven't thanked you. Ellestad said you were working at your programs like a Trojan, and wouldn't stop long enough to draw a full breath. You surely haven't finished them?" "No, it will take nearly 2 days longer," she said, gathering up the reins again. "And you stopped in the middle of it to do this for me?" he exclaimed. "I certainly appreciate your taking so much time and trouble for me, an entire stranger." "Oh, no, you're not a stranger," she protested. "You're Mr. Ellestad's friend." "Then may I ask one more favor at your hands? I'd like to see your programs when they're finished, before you send them away. There is so little to interest one out here," he continued, apologetically, "that if you don't mind humoring an invalid's whims—" "Oh, I'd be glad to," cried Joyce, flushing. "I'll bring them down just as soon as they're done. That is," she added, with a mischievous smile dimpling her face, which made her seem even younger than she was, "if you'll be good and eat every bit of the quail." "I'll promise." he replied, an answering smile lightening his face for an instant. An easy promise to keep, he thought, as he lifted the lid and took out the hot covered dish. The quail on the delicately browned toast was the most tempting thing he had seen in weeks. "What a kind little soul she is," he said to himself as he tasted the first appetizing morsel. "Fairly brimming over with consideration for other people. As Ellestad says, I could do a lot for her, if it seemed the right thing to encourage her." Whether it was the quail, which he ate slowly, enjoying it to the last mouthful, or whether it was the remembrance of a pair of honest, friendly eyes, beaming down on him with neighbourly goodwill and sympathy, he could not tell. But as he went into his tent afterward and lighted the lamp, somehow the desert seemed a little less lonely, the outlook a trifle less hopeless. End of chapter 11. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 12 of The Little Colonel in Arizona. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Little Colonel in Arizona by Annie Fellows Johnston. Chapter 12. Phil has a finger in the pie. Phil went up to the wigwam early next morning. Breakfast was just over, and Joyce had begun painting again. He paused an instant at the front door to watch her brown head bending over the table, and the quick motion of her deft fingers. She was so absorbed in her tasks that she did not look up, so after a moment he went on around the house to the kitchen. Mrs. Ware was lifting the dishpan from its nails to its place on the table, and Lloyd was standing beside her, enveloped in a huge apron, holding a towel in her hand, ready to help. Norman, beside a chair on which a clean napkin had been spread, was filling the salt cellars. Jack, having carried water to the tents, was busy chopping wood. "Good morning," called Lloyd, waving her towel as Phil appeared in the door. Mrs. Ware turned with such a cordial smile of welcome that he took it as an invitation to come in, and hung his hat on the post of a chair. "I want to have a finger in this pie," he announced. "I was told to stay at home yesterday, but I don't intend to be snubbed to day. Wait, Aunt Emily, that kettle is too heavy for you." He had called her Aunt Emily since the first time he had heard Lloyd do it. "You don't care, do you?" he had asked. "It makes a fellow feel so forlorn and familyless when he has to Mister and Madam everybody." She was sewing a button on his coat for him at the time he asked her, and she gave such a pleased assent that he stooped to leave a light kiss on the smooth forehead, where gray hair was beginning to mingle with the brown. Now he took the kettle from her before she could object, and began pouring the boiling water into the pan. "Let me do this," he insisted. "I haven't had a hand in anything of the sort since I was a little shaver. It makes me think of a time when the servants were all away, and Stuart and I helped Aunt Patricia. She paid us in peppermint sticks and cinnamon drops." "You'll get no candy here," she answered, laughing. "You might as well go on if that's what you expect." But there was no resisting the coaxing ways of this big handsome boy, who towered above her, and who took possession in such a masterful way of her apron and dish mop. His coat and cuffs were off the next instant, and he began clattering the china and silverware vigorously through the hot soap suds. Mrs. Ware, taking a big yellow bowl in her lap, sat down to pick over some dried beans, and to enjoy the lively conversation which kept pace with the rattle of the dishes. It was interrupted presently by a complaint from Lloyd. "Aunt Emily, he doesn't wash 'em clean. He's left egg all over this spoon. That's the second time. I've had to throw it back into the water." "Aunt Emily, it isn't so," mocked Phil in a high falsetto voice, imitating her accent.
It's better than she could do herself. She's no great shakes of a housekeeper." "I'll show you," retorted Lloyd, throwing the spoon back into the pan with a splash. "I'm going to make a pie for dinner to day, and you won't get any." "Then probably I'll be the only one who escapes alive to tell the tale. Aunt Emily, please invite me to dinner," he begged. "And mayn't I stay out here and watch her make it?" "Of course I can't help it if she chooses to ask you to dinnah," said Lloyd, loftily, when he had received his invitation. "But I most certainly won't have you standing around in my way, criticizing me when I begin to cook. You can fill the wood box, and brush up the crumbs, and hang these towels out on the line, if you want to. Then you may go in and watch Joyce paint." "Oh, thank you," answered Phil. "Such condescension! Such privileges! Your Royal Highness, I humbly make my bow." He bent low in a burlesque obeisance that a star actor might have envied, and, throwing up a saucer and catching it deftly, began to sing: "The Queen of Hearts she made some tarts Upon a summer day, But none could look. That selfish cook Drove every one away." It was all the most idle nonsense, and yet as they worked together in a playful half quarrel, Lloyd liked him better than she had at any time before. He reminded her of Rob Moore. He was big like Rob, tall and broad-shouldered, but much handsomer. Rob had teased her since babyhood, and when Phil began his banter in the same blunt big brother fashion, it made her feel as if she had known him always. And yet he was more like Malcolm than Rob, in some respects, she thought later. The courteous way he sprang to pick up her handkerchief, the quick turn he gave to some little remark which made it a graceful compliment, his gentlemanly consideration for Mrs. Ware, all that was like Malcolm. Phil would not be driven out of the kitchen until he had exacted a promise from Mrs. Ware that he might come the next day and make the dessert for the morrow's dinner. Vowing that, if it were not heels over head better than Lloyd's, he would treat everybody at the Wigwam and on the ranch to a picnic at Hole in the Rock. "Prop the door open, please," called Joyce as she went into the sitting room from the kitchen. "I need some of that heat in here. It's chilly this morning when one sits still." So Lloyd, moving back and forth at her pastry making, could see their heads bending over the table, and hear snatches of an animated discussion about a design he proposed for her to put on one of the programmes. "Put a line from 'Call Me Thine Own' on this one," he said, "and have a couple of turtle doves perched upon the clef, cooing at each other, and make little hearts for the notes." "How brilliant!" cried Joyce. "Phil, you're a genius. Do think up some more, for I'm nearly at my wits' end trying to get 30 different designs." "Don't make them all so fine," he suggested. "Some of those people will get it into their heads that matrimony is all roses." He lifted his voice a little, so that Lloyd could not fail to hear. She was standing before the moulding board now, her sleeves tucked up, and a look of intense seriousness on her face as she sifted flour, as if pie making were the most important business in the universe. "Make the Queen of Hearts with a rolling pin in her hand and a scowl on her face, as she will look after a ceremony, when she takes it into her head to make some tarts. Put a bar of 'Come ye disconsolate,' with a row of tiny pies for the notes, and the old king doubled up at the end of it, with a knave running for a doctor." "You horrid thing!" called Lloyd, wrathfully, from the kitchen. "You sha'n't have a bite of these pies now." "Nothing personal, I assure you," called Phil, laughing. "I'm only helping the artist." But Joyce said in a low tone, "It is a little personal, because she used to be called the Queen of Hearts so much. Did you ever see her picture taken in that character, when she was dressed in that costume for a Valentine's party? It was years ago. Mrs. Marks made some coloured photographs of her. You've filed one in that portfolio somewhere. if you'll take the trouble to look through it. She's had so many different nicknames," continued Joyce. Norman was hammering on something in the kitchen now, so there was no need for her to lower her voice. "She's the Little Colonel to half the Valley, and I suppose always will be to her grandfather's friends. Then when she started to school about the time that picture was taken, she was such a popular little thing that one of her teachers began calling her Queen of Hearts. Both boys and girls used to fuss for the right to stand beside her in recitations, and march next her at calisthenics, and she was sure to be called first when they chose sides for their games at recess. Then after she was in that play with her dog Hero that Mary told you about, the girls at boarding school began calling her the Princess Winsome, and then just Princess. Malcolm McIntyre, who took the part of the knight who rescued her, never calls her anything but that now. There she is as she looked in the play when she sang the Dove Song." Joyce pointed with a brush handle to another photograph in the pile. It was the same picture that Mary had showed him, the beautiful little medallion of the Princess Winsome, holding the dove to her breast as she sang "Flutter and Fly," the same picture which had swayed on the pendulum in Roney's lonely cabin, repeating with every tick of the clock, "For love will find a way." Phil put it beside the other photograph, and studied them both intently as Joyce went on. "Then the other day, when her father was here, I noticed that he had a new name for her. He called her that several times, and when he went away he said it in a tone that seemed to mean so much. 'Good bye, my little Hildegarde.'" Phil looked from the picture on the table to the original, standing in the kitchen, wielding a rolling pin under Mrs. Ware's direction. The morning sun streaming through the window was making a halo of her hair. Somehow he found this last view the most pleasing. He said nothing, however, only thrummed idly on the table, and hummed an old song that had been running through his head all morning. "What's that you're humming?" asked Joyce, when she had worked on in silence several minutes. Phil came to himself with a start. "I'm sure I don't know," he laughed. "I wasn't conscious that I was making even an attempt to sing." "It went this way," said Joyce, whistling the refrain softly. "It's so sweet." "Oh, that," said Phil, recognizing the air. "That's a song that Elsie's old English nurse used to sing her to sleep with. 'Maid Elsie roams by lane and lea, her heart beats low and sad.' She liked it because it had her name in it, and I liked it because of the jingle of the chorus. It always seemed full of bells to me." He hummed it lightly. "Cling, lang, ling, she seems to hear her bride bells ring, her bonny bride bells ring.' It must have been these bridal musical programs that brought it up to me, for I haven't thought of it in years." "And that suggests something to me," answered Joyce. "I haven't used any wedding bells on these programs. Now let me see, how can I put them on?" She sat studying one of the empty cards intently. "Here, this way!" cried Phil. "I can't draw it as it ought to be, but I can see it in my mind's eye what you want. Put a Cupid up in each top corner, with a bunch of 5 narrow ribbons strung across from one to the other in narrow wavy lines, and hang the little bells on them for notes. Then the ends of the ribbon can trail down the sides of the programs, sort of fluttery and graceful. Pshaw! I can't make it look like anything, but I can see exactly how it ought to look." He scribbled his pencil across the lines he had attempted to draw, and started to tear the paper in disgust when she caught it from him. "I know just what you mean," she cried. "And Phil Tremont, you are a genius. This will be the best design in the whole lot." She was outlining it quickly as she spoke. "You ought to be a designer. You'd make a fortune at it, for originality is what counts. Why don't you study it?" "I did have it in mind for a week or so," answered Phil, "but I wanted most of all to be an architect. or something of the sort. Father wanted me to study medicine, and grandfather thought I'd do better at civil engineering, but I couldn't settle down to anything. I suppose the truth of the matter was I was thinking too much about the good times I was having, and didn't want to buckle down to anything that meant hard digging. So last year father said I wasn't getting any kind of discipline, and that I had to go to a military school for it. That there I would at least learn punctuality and order, and that military training would fit me to be a good citizen just as much as to be a good soldier. "What does he think about it now?" answered Joyce. "I beg your pardon," she added, hastily. "I had no right to ask such a personal question." "That's all right," answered Phil. "I don't care a rap if you do talk about it. It's worried me a good deal thinking how cut up the old pater will feel when he finds out about it. He thought he'd left me in such good hands, shut up where I couldn't get out into any trouble, and I hated to write that they'd fire me almost as soon as his back was turned. If I could have talked to him and explained both sides of it, how unfair the major was, and all that, and how we were just out for a lark with the best intentions in the world, I could have soon convinced him that I meant all right, and he wouldn't have minded so much. But I never was any good at letter writing, so I kept putting it off the first 2 weeks I was here. I wrote last week, but it takes a month to send a letter and get an answer, so it'll be some time yet before I hear from him. In the meantime, I'm taking life easy and worrying as little as possible." Joyce made no reply when he paused, only bent her head a little lower over her work. But Phil, usually sensitive to mental influences, felt her disapprobation as keenly as if she had spoken. The silence began to grow uncomfortably, and finally he asked lightly, toying with a paper knife while he spoke, "Well, what do you think of the situation?" "Do you want to know honestly?" asked Joyce, her head bending still lower over her work. "Yes, honestly." Her face grew red, but looking up, her clear gray eyes met his unflinchingly. "Well, I think you're the very brightest boy that I ever knew anywhere, and that it would be a very easy thing for you to make your mark in the world in any way you pleased, if you would only make up your mind to do it. But it's lazy of you to loaf around all winter doing nothing, not even studying by yourself, and it's selfish to disappoint your father when he's so ambitious for you, and yes, it's wicked for you to waste opportunities that some boys would almost give their eyes for. There!" "Phew!" whistled Phil, getting up to pace the floor with his hands in his pockets. "That's the worst roast I ever got." "Well, you asked for it," said Joyce. "You said for me to tell you honestly what I thought." "What would you have me to do?" asked Phil, impatiently, anxious to justify himself. A fellow with any spirit couldn't get down and beg to be taken back to school when he knew all the time that he was only part in the wrong, and that it was unjust and arbitrary of the officers to require what they did. "That isn't the only school in the country," said Joyce, quietly, "and for a fellow 6 feet tall and 17 years old, a regular athlete in appearance, to wait for somebody to lead him back to his books does seem a little ridiculous, doesn't it?" "Confound it!" he began, angrily, then stopped, for Joyce was smiling up into his face with a friendliness he could not resist, and there was more than censure in her eyes. There was sincere admiration for the handsome boy whom she found so entertaining and companionable. "Now don't get uppity," she laughed. "I'm only saying to you what Elsie would say if she were here." Phil shrugged his shoulders. "Not much!" he exclaimed. "You don't know Elsie. She thinks her big brother is perfection. She has always stood up for me in the face of everything. Daddy never failed to let me off easy when she patched up the peace between us. She wouldn't rake me over the coals the way you do." Joyce liked the expression that crossed his face as he spoke of Elsie, and the gentler tone in which he said Daddy. "And the more reason, then," she answered, "that somebody else should do the raking. I hope I haven't been officious. It's only what I would say to Jack under the same circumstances. I'm so used to preaching to the boys that I couldn't help sailing in when you gave me leave. I won't do it any more, though. See, here is the design you suggested. I've finished it." Mollified by her tone and her evident eagerness to leave the subject, he dropped into the chair beside her again, and sat talking until Lloyd called them both out to admire her pies. There were two of them on the table, hot from the oven, so crisp and delicately browned that Lloyd danced around them, clicking a couple of spoons in each hand like castanets, and calling Mrs. Ware to witness that she had made them entirely by herself. "Don't they look delicious?" she cried. "Did you ever see more tempting looking pies in all your life? I wish grandfathah could have a slice of that beautiful custard with the meringue on top. He'd think Mom Beck made it, and he'd never believe, unless he saw it with his own eyes, that I could make such darling cross baths as are on that cherry tart." "I wish you'd listen," cried Phil. "Don't you know that proverb about letting another man praise thee, and not thine own mouth?" "I'm not praising me," retorted Lloyd. "I'm just praising my pies, and if they're good, and I know they're good, why shouldn't I say so? They're the first I ever made, and I think I have a right to be proud of their turning out so well. Of course they wouldn't have been this nice if Aunt Emily hadn't showed me what to do." "Let's sample them now," proposed Jack, who had been called in from the woodpile to pay his respects to the pastry. Lloyd threw herself between the table and Jack with a little scream of remonstrance, as he advanced threateningly with a knife. "I believe Lloyd is prouder of making those old pies than she was of shooting the duck. Confess now, aren't you?" he insisted. "Yes, I am," she answered, emphatically. "You had your picture taken with the duck," suggested Phil. "Suppose you have one now with the pies to add to your collection. Come on and get your camera, and I'll take a companion piece to the hunting picture. We'll call this the Queen of Tarts. Stand out back of the tent, and hold the custard pie in one hand and the cherry tart in the other." With the dimples deepening in her cheeks as the whole family gathered around to watch the performance, Lloyd took her position out of doors, with the white tent for a background. Holding her hands stiffly out in front of her, she stood like a statue, while Jack and Joyce each brought out a pie and balanced them in the middle of her little pink upturned palms. "I want to take 2 shots," said Phil, waiting for them to step out of range. "There are several blank films left on this roll. Now," he ordered, when the shutter clicked after the first exposure, "hold still. We'll try another. Suppose you put the plates up on the tips of your fingers, the way hotel waiters do. They carry things that way with such an easy, offhand grace. I always admired it." "I should say it was offhand," cried Jack, for Lloyd, obeying orders, clutched frantically after the cherry tart with a shriek of dismay. It had refused to stay poised on her finger tips. "Topside down, of course," she wailed, as the broken plate fell in one place and the pastry in another. "And the juice is running all over me, and the darling little crossbars are all in the sand." Phil hastily clicked the shutter again. He was sure that the second snap had caught the tart in the act of falling, and with the third film he wanted to preserve the expression of surprise and dismay that clouded Lloyd's face. It was one of the most ludicrous expressions he had ever seen. "'Pride goes before destruction,'" he quoted laughingly. "I wish you'd hush up with your old proverbs, Phil Tremont," cried Lloyd, half laughing and half angry. "It's all your fault, anyway. You knew I'd spill that tart if I'd held it that way, and I just believe you did it on purpose. You knew when you first saw those pies it would be useless for you to try to make any dessert to morrow that would halfway come up to them, and you deliberately planned to get them out of the way so you wouldn't have to stand the test. You were afraid you'd have to give the picnic you promised." "Sputter away, if it will ease your mind any," laughed Phil. "It was worth the picnic to see your frantic grab after that tart. But honestly, Lloyd," he said, growing serious as he saw she really cared, "I'm as sorry as I can be that it happened, and I'll do anything you say to make atonement. I'll withdraw from the contest, award you the laurels, and give the picnic anyhow." "There's nothing the matter with the custard pie," piped up Norman, "except you can see where Joyce's fingers jabbed into the meringue where she caught it from Lloyd. I think it would be safer to eat it now before anything else happens." "No, we'll set mamma to guard it till the rest of the dinner is ready," said Joyce, leading the way back to the kitchen. "If everybody will fly around and help, we'll have it a little earlier to day." It was one of the jolliest meals that Phil had had in the Wigwam. "Let's all go to Phoenix this afternoon," proposed Phil, when they had gone back to the sitting room. "We can take the films in to the photographer and have them developed. Joyce, you may ride my horse, and I'll get one from Mrs. Lee." "Oh, thank you!" cried Joyce, looking wistfully through the window. "The outdoors never did look so tempting, it seems to me. And those programs are getting so monotonous, I can hardly make myself go back to them. I wish I could go, but I can't shirk even for a few hours, or they might miss getting there in time." "Couldn't anything tempt you to go?" urged Phil. She shook her head resolutely. "Not all the king's horses and all the king's men could draw me away from these programs till they are finished." "No wonder she preached me such a sermon on loafing this morning," thought Phil, as he rode away beside Jack with the roll of films in his pocket. "Anybody with that much energy and perseverance doesn't need to go to the School of the Bees. It makes her all the harder on the drones. And I know that's what she thinks I am." End of chapter 12. Read by Lars Rolander.
Chapter 13 of The Little Colonel in Arizona. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Little Colonel in Arizona by Annie Fellows Johnston. Chapter 13. A Change of Fortune. It was nearly 2 o'clock next day when the 30th program was finished and placed in the last row of dainty cards laid out for the family's farewell inspection. While Lloyd cut the squares of tissue paper which were to lie between them, Joyce brought the box in which they were to be packed, and the white ribbons to tie them. Jack, having saddled Washington, was blacking his shoes and making other preparations for his ride to town. A special trip had to be made in order to get the package to the Phoenix post office in time. "They might wait until morning, I suppose," said Joyce, as she began placing them carefully in piles of 10. "But it is best to allow all the time possible for delays. Then the programs have to be written on them after they get to Plainsville. Oh, I hope Mrs. Link will like them." "I don't see how she can help it," exclaimed Lloyd. "They're lovely, and I think you'd be so proud of them you wouldn't know what to do." "I am pleased with them," admitted Joyce, stopping to take one last peep at the pretty rose-garlanded cupids ringing the bride bells which Phil had suggested. It was the best design in the lot, she thought. "Oh, I forgot!" she exclaimed suddenly, looking up in dismay. "What shall I do? I promised Mr. Armond that I'd let him see these cards before I sent them away." "You won't have time now," suggested Lloyd. "I suppose Jack could wait a few minutes, but I thought we'd start over to Shaw's ranch just as soon as the cards were off. I didn't want to lose a minute in getting my hive of bees after I'd earned them. It's such a long walk over there and back that I don't feel like going to the ranch first." "Let Jack stop and show them to Mr. Armond," suggested her mother. "He's always so careful that he can be trusted to tie the box up safely afterward." "Oh, he's safe enough," answered Joyce, "but he'd make such a mess of it, tying and untying the white ribbons on the inside of the package. He can't make a decent bow to save his life. He'd have them all in knots and strings, and after all the care I've taken, I want Mrs. Link to find them just as they leave me." For a moment Joyce stood undecided, regretting her promise to Mr. Armond, and sorely tempted to break it. "He won't really care," she thought, but his own words came back to her plaintively. "There is so little to interest one here, if you don't mind humouring an invalid's whims." She couldn't forget the hopeless melancholy of his face, and what Mr. Ellestad had said to her about him. "He's just where Sharper was when the caravan went on without him." And she remembered that in the story Sharper had cursed the day he was born, and laid his head in the dust. "I'll go," she exclaimed. "Jack can follow as soon as he is ready, and I'll hand the package to him as he passes. I'll be back as soon as I can, Lloyd, and then we'll start right over to Mr. Shaw's. You explain to Jack, please, mamma, and give him the money to pay the postage." Stopping only long enough to write the address on the wrapper, she hurried down the road, bareheaded, toward the ranch. Lloyd sat down on the front step to wait for her return. Opening a book in which she had become interested, she was soon so deep in the story that she scarcely noticed when Jack rode away a quarter of an hour later, glancing up for just an instant as she waved her hand mechanically in answer to his call. The kitchen clock struck 2:30, then 3. With the last stroke came a vague consciousness that it was growing late, and that Joyce was long in coming, but the absorbing interest of the story made her immediately forgetful again of her surroundings. It was nearly 4 when Mrs. Ware, coming out beside her on the step, stood shading her eyes with her hand to peer down the road. "I can't imagine what keeps Joyce so long," she said, anxiously. "It will soon be too late for you to go to the Shaws." But even as she spoke, Joyce came in sight, running as Lloyd had never seen her run before. She had left the dusty road, and was bobbing along on the edge of the desert, where the hard, dry sand, baked into a crust, made travelling easier. "Oh, you'll never guess what kept me," she called, as she hurried up to the door, eager and breathless. Seizing her mother around the waist, she gave her a great squeeze. "Oh, I'm so happy and excited that I don't know whether I'm on my head or my heels. I feel like a cyclone caught in a jubilee, or a jubilee caught in a cyclone. I don't know which. There never was such glorious good fortune in the world for anybody." "Do stop your prancing and dancing and tell us," demanded Lloyd, "or we'll think that you've lost your mind." Joyce sank down beside her on the doorstep. Her face was shining with a great gladness, and she could hardly find breath to begin. "Oh, there aren't words good enough to tell it in," she gasped. "Mr. Armond is an artist, mother, a really great one, who has had pictures hung in the Salon and the Academy. Mr. Ellestad walked part of the way home with me, and told me about him. He studied for years in Paris, and lived in the Latin Quarter, and had a studio there just like Cousin Kate's friend, Mr. Harvey. And that's the man Mr. Armond looks like," she added, triumphantly. "I've been trying to think ever since I first met him who I had seen before with a short Van Dyck beard like his, and long, alive-looking fingers that seemed to have brains of their own." "And that's what makes you so glad?" laughed Lloyd. "To think you've discovered the resemblance? Do get to the point. I'm wild to know."
Well, he liked my work, thought it showed originality and promise, and if mamma is willing, he wants to give me lessons. Think of that, Lloyd Sherman, lessons from an artist, a really great artist like that. Why, it would mean more for me than years of class instruction in the Art League or anywhere else. He seemed pleased when I told him that I wanted to do illustrating, because he said that was something practical, and work that would find a ready market. He told me so many interesting things about famous illustrators that he has known, that I have come away all on fire to begin. My fingers fairly tingle. Oh, mamma!" she cried, two great happy tears welling up into her eyes. "Isn't it splendid? The story of Sharper is true. For me the desert holds a greater opportunity than kings' houses could offer."
"But the prize, my dear little girl?"
"And that's the best of it," interrupted Joyce. "He asked to be allowed to do it for nothing. Time hangs so heavily on his hands that he said it would be a charity to give him something to do. And Mr. Ellestad told me afterward, as we walked home, that I ought to let him, because it's the first thing that he has taken any interest in for months, that with something to occupy his mind and make him contented, he would get better much faster. When I tried to thank him and told him that he had showed me a better way to the city of my desire than the one I had planned for myself, he said with the brightest kind of a smile,
"I expect to get far more out of this arrangement than you, my little girl. You are the alchemist whose courage and hope shall help me distill some drop of contentment out of this dreary existence."
"He's going to drive up here to morrow to ask you about it, and to see the work I have already done. I'm glad now that I saved all those charcoal sketches of block hands and ears and things, and I'm going to get out all those still life studies I did with Miss Brown, and pin them up on the wall, so he'll know just how far I've gone, and where to start in with me." "Get them out now," said Lloyd. "You never did show them to me." There was some very creditable work hidden away in the old portfolio, and while they talked and looked and arranged the studies on the wall, time slipped by unnoticed. "Aren't you mighty proud, Aunt Emily?" asked Lloyd, stepping back for a final view, when the exhibit was duly arranged. "Proud and glad," answered Mrs. Ware, with a happy light in her eyes. "It was always my dream to be an artist myself, and now to see my unfulfilled ambitions realized in Joyce more than compensates for all my disappointments."
"Phil's coming," called Norman from the yard.
"And we haven't started for the bees!" exclaimed Joyce. "It's so late, we'll have to put it off until to morrow." But all plans for the morrow were laid aside when Phil told his errand. He would not dismount, but paused just a moment to invite them to the promised picnic at Hole in the Rock.
"Everybody on the ranch is going," he explained, "even Joe, to make the coffee and unpack the lunch. There'll be a carriage here for you, Aunt Emily, at 3 o'clock, and you must let Mary and Holland stay home from school to go. No, don't bother to take any picnic baskets," he interrupted hastily, as Mrs. Ware started to say something about lunch. "This is my affair. Joe is equal to anything, even cherry tarts and custard pies, and I must make the atonement I promised to Lloyd for spilling hers." Waiting only long enough to hear their pleased acceptance, he dashed off down the road again. Ever since her arrival in Arizona, Lloyd had wanted to see the famous Hole in the Rock. It lay several miles across the desert in a great red butte. There was a picture of it in the ranch parlor, and nearly every tourist who passed through Phoenix made a pilgrimage to the spot, and took snapshots of this curious freak of nature. Climbing up the butte toward it, one seemed to be going into a mighty cave, but when he had passed up into the opening, and down over a ledge of rock, he saw that the cave led straight through the butte, like an enormous tunnel, and at the farther end opened out on the other side of the mountain, giving a wide outlook over the surrounding desert. It was a favorite spot for picnic parties, but of all ever gathered there, none had had so many preparations made for the comfort of the guests. Phil rode over several times, once to be sure that the wood he had ordered for the camp fire had been delivered, and again to take a load of canvas chairs, rubber blankets, rugs, and cushions, so that even the invalids on the ranch could enjoy the outing. It was the 1st of March. Where the irrigating ditches ran, almond and peach orchards were pink with bloom. California poppies, golden as the sunshine, nodded on the edges of the waving green wheat. Even the dry, hard desert was sweet in its miracle of blossoming. A carpet of bloom covered it, stems so short that they could scarcely raise the buds they bore above the sand bravely pierced the hard-baked crust. Great masses of yellow and blue, white, lavender, and scarlet transformed the bleak, solitary places for a little while into a glory of color and perfume. An odor, sweet as if blown across acres of narcissus, made Mrs. Ware turn her head with a little cry of pleasure as they drove along toward the butte the afternoon of the picnic. "It's the desert mistletoe," explained Phil, who was following on horseback with Lloyd and Joyce the surrey which Jack was driving. "It is in the blossom now, hanging in bunches from all those high bushes over yonder. Mrs. Lee says it isn't like ours. The berries, instead of being little white wax ones like pearls, shade from a deep red to the palest rose pink." "How lovely!" exclaimed Lloyd. "I hope I'll see some of the berries before I go home. Oh, deah, the days are slipping by so fast. The month will be gone before I know it." Phil, seeing the wistful expression in the eyes raised to his for a moment, laid a detaining hand on her bridle rein. "Let's walk the horses, then," he said, laughingly, "and make the minutes last just as long as possible. We'll have to fill the few days left to us so full of pleasant things that you'll never forget them. I don't want you to forget this day, anyhow, because it is in your especial honor that this picnic is given, because you're such an accomplished Queen of Hearts." "Tahts, you mean," she answered, correcting him. "Maybe I mean both," he replied, with an admiring glance that sent a quick blush to her face, and made her spur her pony on ahead. There were more things than that fragrant, breezy ride across the desert to make her remember the day. There was the delicious supper that Joe spread out under the sheltering ledge of rock at the entrance to the great hole. There were the jokes and conundrums that passed around as they ate, the witty repartee of the boy from Belfast that kept them all laughing, and the stories gathered, like the guests from all parts of the world. "This is the first picnic I have been to since the one at the old mill, when you had your house party," said Joyce, snuggling up beside Lloyd against a pile of cushions, after supper, as the blazing camp fire dispelled the gathering shadows of the twilight. "There is as much difference between the two picnics as there is between a cat and a tigah," said Lloyd, tingling with the horror of an Indian story that the cowboy had just told. "Mine was so tame, and this is so exciting. I'm glad that I didn't live out West in the times they are telling about. Just listen." Phil had asked for an Indian story from each one, and Mrs. Lee had begun to tell her experiences during her first years on the ranch. No actual harm had come to her, but several terrible frights during a dreadful Apache uprising. She had been alone on the ranch, with only George, who was a baby then, and a neighbour's daughter for company. They had seen the smoke and flames shoot up from a distant ranch, where the Indians fired all the buildings and haystacks, and they had waited in terror through the long hours, not knowing what moment an arrow might come hurtling through the window of the little adobe house, where they cowered in darkness. In frightened whispers they discussed what they should do if the Apaches should come, and the only means of escape left to them was to take the baby and climb down the jagged rocks that lined the walls of the well. The water was about shoulder deep. Even that was a dangerous proceeding, for there was the fear that the baby might cry and call attention to their hiding place, or that some thirsty Indian, coming for water, might discover them. Mrs. Lee told it in such a realistic way that Lloyd almost held her breath, feeling in part the same fear that had seized the helpless women as they waited for the dreaded war whoop, and watched the flames over their neighbors' dwellings. She shuddered when she heard of the scene that was discovered at the desolate ranch next morning. An entire family had been massacred and scalped and left beside the charred ruins of their home. Even the little blue-eyed baby had not escaped. As the twilight deepened, the stories passing around the camp fire seemed to grow more dreadful. Mary was afraid to look behind her, and presently hiding her face in her mother's lap, stuck her fingers in her ears. It was a relief to more than Mary when Joe, who had been packing the dishes back into the baskets behind the scenes, came rushing into the circle around the fire, so excited that, in his wild mixture of Japanese and broken English, he could hardly make himself understood. He was holding out both forefingers, from each of which trickled a little stream of blood. Each bore the gash of a carving knife, which had slipped through his fingers in his careless handling of it, as he kept his ears strained to hear the Indian stories. He laughed and jabbered excitedly, with a broad grin on his face. Finally he succeeded in making Mrs. Lee understand that the cutting of both forefingers at the same moment was the sign that there was some extraordinary good fortune in store for him. It was the luckiest thing that could have befallen him, and he declared that he must go at once to the Chinese lottery in Phoenix. "If I touch a ticket with these," he cried, holding up his bleeding fingers, "I get a heap much money, for 5 double times so much as I put in. I be back for get a breakfast," he called, suddenly darting away. Before Mrs. Lee could protest, he was on his wheel, tearing across the desert trail toward Phoenix, like some uncanny wild thing of the night. "The superstitious little heathen!" exclaimed Mrs. Lee. "If he should win, I may never lay eyes on him again. He's not the first good cook that I've lost in that way. I have found that if one once gets the gambling fever, I may as well begin to look immediately for a new one." "Chris says he has seen men lose $10,000 at a time," broke in Holland, his eyes big with interest. "Prospectors used to come in from the mines with their gold dust and nuggets, and they'd spread down a blanket right on the street corner and play sometimes till they'd lose everything they had." "It's the curse of the West," sighed Mrs. Lee. "I could tell some pitiful tales of the young men and boys I have known who came out here for their health, got infatuated with the different games of chance, and lost everything. One man I knew was such a nervous wreck from the shock of finding himself a pauper as well as an invalid that he lost his mind and committed suicide. Another had to be taken care of in his last days and be buried by a charitable society, and another had to write to his sister that he was penniless. She sewed for a living, and she sewed then to support him, till she worked herself ill and died before he did. He spent his last days in the almshouse." "We should have showed Joe Alaka's eyes and told him the Indian legend," said Mr. Ellestad, pointing up to the stars. "Do you see those two bright ones just over Camelback Mountain? Look up in a straight line from the head, and you will see two stars, unusually brilliant and twinkling. Those are the eyes of the god Alaka. He lost them in gambling. An old settler told me the story. He got it from an Indian, and as I read something like it in a Chicago paper this winter, I think we may be justified in believing it. At least it is as plausible as the old myths the ancients told of the stars. Cassiopeia's chair, for instance, and Leo's sickle."
"Tell it," begged Lloyd. "I'd rather hear them than those blood and thunder Apache stories. I'll not be able to close my eyes to night." Every voice in the circle joined in the chorus of assents that went up, except Phil's, and no one noticed his silence but Lloyd. It seemed to her that he had looked uncomfortable ever since Mrs. Lee had spoken so feelingly of the curse of the West. But she told herself that it must be just her imagination, that it was the flickering shadows of the camp fire that gave his face its peculiar expression. He moved back into the darkness against the rock, with his hat over his eyes, as Mr. Ellestad began the story. Once there was a young god named Alaka, sent by the Great Spirit to live a while among the cliff dwellers of the Southwest. Now in that country there is a fever that lays hold of the children of the sun. It comes you know not how, and you cannot stop it. And this fever that runs hot in the veins of men began to course through the blood of Alaka, a fierce fever to gamble. At first, when men challenged him to pit his skill against theirs, he refused, knowing that the Great Spirit had forbidden it. But they jeered him, saying, 'Aha! He's afraid that he will lose. This can be no god, or he would not fear us.' So when they had made a mock of him until he could no longer endure it, he cried, 'Come, I will show you that I am a god, that I fear nothing.' Forgetting all that the Great Spirit had enjoined upon him, he plunged madly into the game. Now the most precious thing known to that people is the turquoise, for it is the stone that stole its color from the sky. Around the neck of the young god hung a string of these turquoises, and one by one he lost them, till the morning found him with only an empty string in his hand. Still the fever was upon him, and he could not assuage it. So he put up his shells from the great water in the west. These people had heard of a great water many days' journey toward the setting sun, but to the dwellers in the land of thirst it seemed incredible to them that there could be so much water in the world as Alaka told them of. But they looked upon the exquisite color of the shells he brought, which held the murmur of the sea in their hearts, and counted them wonderful treasures. And they gambled all day with Alaka to gain possession of them. Still the fever waxed hotter than ever within him, and when he had lost his shells, he put up his measure of sacred meal. When he lost that, they made a mock of him again, saying not that he was afraid to lose, but that he had no skill, that he was not a god. He was less than a man. He was only a papoose, and that he should play no more until he had learned wisdom. Then Alaka was beside himself with rage. 'I will show you,' he cried. 'I will venture such mighty stakes that I must win.' He plucked out his right eye, and laid it where the turquoises, the shells, and the sacred meal had lain. But the eye was lost also, and after that the left eye, so that when morning dawned, he staggered into the sunrise, blind and ruined. Then he called upon the Great Spirit to give him back his sight. But the Great Spirit was angry with him, and drove him away into the land of shadows. And he caught up the eyes and said, 'I will hang them up among the stars to be a warning for ever to the children of men not to gamble.' So they hang there to this day, and the wise look up, and seeing them pray to the Great Spirit to keep them from the fever, but the unheeding go on, till, like Alaka, they lose their all, and are lost themselves in the land of shadow." That was the last story told that evening around the camp fire. The moon was coming up, and Phil brought out Mrs. Ware's old guitar, which she had restrung for the occasion. Striking a few rattling chords, he started off on an old familiar song, calling on all the company to join. His voice was a surprise to every one, a full, sweet tenor, strong and clear, that soared out above all the others, except Mrs. Lee's full high soprano. The Scotchman rumbled along with a heavy bass,
One by one the others caught up the song, even little Norman joining in the chorus. Lloyd was the only one who sat silent. "Sing!" whispered Joyce, giving her a commanding nudge. Lloyd shook her head. "It's so heavenly sweet, I want to listen," she replied under cover of the song. The music and the mountains and the moonlight, with the wide white desert stretching away on every side, seemed to cast some sort of witchery over her, and she sat with hands clasped and lips parted, almost afraid to breathe, for fear that what seemed to be a beautiful dream would come to end. A tremulous little sigh escaped her when it did come to an end. "It's time to strike the trail again," called Mrs. Lee. "That is the worst of these outings. We can't stay singing on the mountains. We have to get down to earth again. My return to valley life will take me into the deepest depths if Jo doesn't come back in the morning to get breakfast." "Oh, it was so beautiful," sighed Lloyd later, when the party finally started homeward across the moon whitened desert. It had taken some time to collect all the chairs, hampers, and cushions which George and Holland took home in the ranch wagon. The moon was directly overhead. Lloyd was riding beside Phil, a little in advance of the others. "It was the very nicest picnic I ever went to, Phil," she said, "and it's the loveliest memory that I'll have to take home with me of this visit to Arizona." "I'm glad you enjoyed it," he answered, taking off his hat and riding along beside her, bareheaded in the moonlight. How big and handsome he looked, she thought, sitting up so erect in his saddle, with his eyes smiling down into hers. "I don't want you ever to forget." He hesitated an instant, then added in a lower tone, "Arizona." The sweet odours of the night came blowing up from every direction, the ethereal fragrance of the mistletoe bloom, the heavy perfume of the orange blossoms hanging white in distant orchards. Behind them the picnickers began to sing again, "Roll along, silver moon, guide the traveller on his way." Lloyd looked around for Joyce. She was riding far in the rear of the caravan, beside the carriage where Mrs. Lee led the chorus. Presently the old tune changed, and some one started the Bedouin love song, "From the desert I come to thee." Looking down at her again with smiling eyes, Phil took up the words, sending them rolling out on the night in a voice that thrilled her with its sweetness, as they rode on side by side across the moonlighted desert. "Till the sun grows cold, and the stars are old, and the leaves of the judgment book unfold." End of chapter 13. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 14 of The Little Colonel in Arizona. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Little Colonel in Arizona by Annie Fellows Johnston. Chapter 14. The Lost Turquoises. That night there was a whispered consultation in Mrs. Ware's tent while Lloyd was undressing in the other one. Sitting on the edge of her mother's bed, Joyce rapidly outlined a plan which she had thought of on her way home. "You see, I haven't done anything special at all to give Lloyd a good time," she began. "This picnic was Phil's affair. When I was at her house party, there was something new on the programme nearly every day. She's been here nearly a month now, and her visit will soon be over. I'd like to give her one real larky day before she goes. Mrs. Lee said I could have Bogus to morrow, and as it is Saturday, the children will be at home to help you.
So I thought it would be fun for Jack and Lloyd and me to ride over to the Indian school. It's so interesting, and it doesn't cost anything to get in. Then we could go on to the ostrich farm just outside of Phoenix. Lloyd wants to get some kodak pictures of the ostriches. The admission fee will only be 75 cents for the three of us. I can pay that out of the money that Mrs. Link sent, and get a nice little lunch at Coffee Al's restaurant, and still have enough left to pay for my hive of bees. We can spend the rest of the afternoon prowling around the curio shops and picture stores. Lloyd wants to get ever so many things to take home, bead belts and moccasins, and things made out of cactus and orange wood. I haven't said anything to her about it yet, but Phil said that if we went, he would join us." "I think that is a very good plan," said Mrs. Ware, entering into whatever Joyce proposed with hearty interest. "You'd better not tell her to night, or you'll lie awake talking about it too long, and you'll need to make an early start, you know." By 8:30 next morning the little cavalcade was on its way, Jack and Lloyd riding on ahead, and Phil and Joyce following leisurely. The road they took led through irrigated lands, and green fields and blooming orchards greeted them at every turn, instead of the vast stretches of desert that they were accustomed to seeing. "I wish you'd look!" exclaimed Lloyd, drawing rein to wait for Joyce and Phil, and then pointing to a field where a boy was ploughing a long, straight furrow. "That's an Indian ploughing there. An Indian in a cadet uniform with brass buttons on it. Doesn't it seem queer? Jack says it's the uniform of the school, and that they have to wear it when they hire out to the farmers. This is part of their education. I like them best in tomahawks and blankets. It seems more natural."
"This isn't Hiawatha's land," laughed Phil, "nor the Pathfinder's country. I was disappointed, too, to find them so tame and unromantic looking, but they're certainly more pleasant as neighbours since they have taken to civilization. You remember the horrible tales we heard last night?" Lloyd had expected to see a large school building, but she was surprised to find in addition so many other buildings. Dormitories, workshops, a public hall, and the fine wide streets leading around the central square gave the appearance of a thrifty little village. They lingered long in the kindergarten, where the bright-eyed little papooses were so interested in watching them that they almost forgot the song they were singing about baby's ball so soft and round. They went through the great kitchens, where Indian girls were learning to cook, and the tailoring establishment, where the boys were turning out the new uniforms. Down in one of the parlours, a little eagle-eyed girl, with features strikingly like those of Sitting Bull, practised the five-finger exercises at the piano. Only twice did they see anything that reminded them of the primitive Indians. In one of the workshops a swarthy boy sat before a loom such as the old squaws used to have, weaving patiently a Navajo blanket. And in one of the buildings where dressmaking was taught, there was a table surrounded by busy bead workers, working on chains and belts and gaily decorated trinkets that made Lloyd wish for a bottomless purse. They were all so tempting. So much time was occupied in watching the classes in wood carving, and in listening to recitations in the various rooms, that it was nearly noon when they reached the ostrich farm. It was not the ranch where the great birds were hatched and raised, but a large enclosure near the street car line, where they were brought to be exhibited to the tourists. So, after watching the foolish-looking creatures a while, laughing at their comical expressions as they tilted mincingly up and down in what Lloyd called the perfection of cake walking, and taking several snapshots of them, Joyce proposed that they should leave their horses at a corral farther down the street, and go at once for their lunch. It was the first time that Jack had been inside the restaurant, and he was glad that Phil, who often lunched there, was with them to take the lead. He felt very young and inexperienced in the ways of the world as he marched in behind him. And while he secretly admired the lordly air with which Phil gave his orders, he saw that the girls were impressed by it too, and he inwardly resented being made to appear such an insignificant small boy by contrast. He had supposed that they would sit up on the stools at the lunch counters which one could see from the street. That is where he, in his ignorance, would have piloted the party. But Phil, passing them by, led the way upstairs. An attractive-looking dining room opened out from the upper hall. But, ignoring that also, Phil kept on to a balcony overlooking the street, where there were several small tables. "They serve out here in hot weather," he said, "and it's warm enough to day, I'm sure. Besides, we'll be all by ourselves and can see what is going on down below. Here, Sambo." He beckoned to a colored waiter passing through the hall, and soon had him scurrying around in haste to fill their orders. It was the most enjoyable little lunch Lloyd could remember. Phil, who somehow naturally assumed the part of host, had never been so entertaining. Time slipped by so fast while they laughed and talked that the hour was finished before they realized that it had fairly begun. Then Phil, putting Lloyd's camera on an opposite table and focusing it on the group, showed the waiter how to snap the spring, and hurried back to his chair to be included in the picture, which they all wanted as a souvenir of the day's excursion. They made arrangements for the rest of the afternoon after that. Jack was to take the camera to photographers and leave it for the roll of films to be developed, and then go to a shoe store and the grocery. Phil had an errand to attend to for Mrs. Lee and a few purchases to make. Lloyd had a long list of things she hoped to find in the Curio Building. They agreed to meet at a drug store on that street, which had a corner especially furnished for the comfort of its out-of-town patrons. Besides the numerous easy chairs and tables, where tired customers could be served at any time from the soda fountain, there were daily papers to help pass the time of waiting, and a desk provided with free stationery. It was just 4 o'clock when Joyce and Lloyd, coming back to the drug store with their arms full of packages, found Jack already there waiting for them. He was weighing himself on the scales near the door. "I've been knocking around here for the last half hour," he said. "I'll go out and look for Phil now, and tell him you are ready, and we'll get the horses and bring them around." "How long will it take?" asked Joyce. 15 or 20 minutes, probably. He's just up the street." "Then I'll begin a letter to mothah," said Lloyd, depositing her bundles on a table, and sitting down at the desk. Joyce picked up an illustrated paper and settled herself comfortably in a rocking chair. The big clock over the soda fountain slowly dropped its hands down the dial, but Joyce, absorbed in her reading, and Lloyd in her writing, paid no attention until half an hour had gone by. Then Lloyd, folding her letter and slipping it into an envelope, looked up. "Mercy, Joyce! It's 4:30. What do you suppose is the mattah?" Before Joyce could answer, she caught sight of Jack through the big show window, hurrying down the street by himself. He was red in the face from his rapid walking when he came in, and had a queer expression about his mouth that he always had when disgusted or out of patience. "Phil's busy," he announced. "He wants me to ask you if you'd mind waiting a few minutes longer. He wouldn't ask it, but it's something quite important." "We ought to get back as soon as we can," said Joyce, "for I've been away all day, and there's the ride home still ahead of us. I'm afraid mamma will start to get supper herself if I'm not there." "I think I'll put in the time we're waiting in writing to the Walton girls," said Lloyd, drawing a fresh sheet of paper toward her. Joyce picked up her story again, and Jack went out into the street, where he stood tapping one heel against the curbstone, and with his hands thrust into his pockets. Then he walked to the corner and back, and peered in through the show window at the clock over the soda fountain. When he had repeated the performance several times, Joyce beckoned for him to come in.
"It's after 5 o'clock," she said. "It must be very important business that keeps him so long."
"It is," answered Jack. "I'll go back once more, and if I can't get him away, I'll go around and get the horses, and we'll just ride off and leave him."
"Can't get him away?" repeated Joyce. "Where is he?"
"Oh, just up the street a little way," said Jack, carelessly pointing over his shoulder with his thumb.
Joyce looked at him steadily an instant, then, as if she had read his mind, said with startling abruptness, "Jack Ware, you might as well tell me. Is he doing what Mr. Ellestad says all the boys out here do sooner or later? Getting mixed up in some of those gambling games?"
There was no evading Joyce when she spoke in that tone. Jack had learned that long ago. But with a glance toward Lloyd, who sat with her back toward them, he only nodded his reply. Startled by the question, Lloyd turned just in time to see the nod. "I didn't intend to tell on him," blurted Jack, "but you surprised it out of me. He put some money on a roulette wheel, and lost all the first part of the afternoon. Now his luck has begun to change, and he says he's got to stick by it till he makes back at least part of what he started with."
Joyce looked up at the clock. "We ought to be going," she said, drumming nervously on the arm of her chair with her fingers. Then she hesitated, a look of sisterly concern on her face. "I hate, though, to go off and leave him there. No telling when he'll come home, if he feels he's free to stay as long as he pleases. Goodness, Jack, I'm glad it isn't you. I'd be having a fit if it were, and I can't help thinking how poor Elsie would feel if she knew it. Lloyd, what do you think we ought to do?" "I think we ought to go straight off and leave him," she answered, hotly. "It's perfectly horrid of him to so far forget himself as a gentleman as to pay no attention to his promises. He made a positive engagement with us to meet us here at 4 o'clock, and now it's after 5. I never had a boy treat me that way before, and I must say I haven't much use for one that will act so."
Presently, after some slight discussion, the girls slowly gathered up the bundles and walked up the street to the corral. Jack hurried on ahead, so that by the time they reached it, the men there had the ponies saddled and were waiting to help them mount and tie on the packages by the many leather thongs which fringed the saddles for that purpose. It was a quiet ride homeward. A cloud seemed to have settled over their gay spirits. Nobody laughed, nobody spoke much. The story of Alaka was still fresh in each mind, and what Mrs. Lee had said about the curse of the West, and the fate of the men she had known who had become possessed by the same fever. They remembered how Joe had come in at daylight, red-eyed and sullen after its night's losses, for the lucky feeling which seized him at the sight of his cut fingers had been a mistaken omen of success. All that he had saved in months of service had vanished before sunrise in the same way that Alaka's turquoises and shells and ice had gone. Deeper than the indignation in Lloyd's heart, deeper than her sense of wounded pride that Phil should have been so indifferent about keeping his engagement to meet them, was a sore feeling of disappointment in him. He had seemed so strong and manly that she had thought him above the weakness of yielding to such temptations. She recalled the expression of his face the night before, when he drew back from the firelight into the shadow, and pulled his hat over his eyes, as Mr. Ellestad began the story of Alaka. Evidently he had played Alaka's game before. Ah, that night before! How the whole moonlighted scene rolled back over her memory as she rode along now, slightly in advance of Joyce and Jack. Phil had been with her that night before, and as the sweet strains of the Bedouin love song floated out on the stillness of the desert, something had stirred in her girlish heart as she looked up at him. A vague wonder if it were possible that in years to come this would prove to be the one the stars had destined for her. And as if in an answer to her unspoken wonder, his voice had joined in, higher and sweeter than all the others,
as he smiled down into her eyes. But now there was a little twinge of pain when she thought that he wasn't a prince at all when measured by the yardstick of old Hildgardmar and her father, much less the one written in the stars for her. He wasn't strong, and he wasn't honorable if he gambled, and she told herself that she was glad that she knew it. And now that she had found out how much she had been mistaken in him, she didn't care any more for his friendship, and that she never intended to have anything more to do with him. A dozen times on the way home Joyce said to herself, "Oh, what if it had been Jack?" And thinking of Elsie and the father so far away across the seas, she wished that she could do something to get him away from the surroundings that were sure to work to his undoing if he persisted in staying there. Supper was ready when they reached home. Afterward there were all Lloyd's purchases to be unwrapped and admired. Mary had hoped for a candy pull, as it was Saturday, and they had not had one during Lloyd's visit. But the girls were too tired after so many miles in the saddle, and by 9 o'clock all lights were out, and a deep quiet reigned over Ware's wigwam and the tents. The moonlight flooding the white canvas kept Lloyd awake for a while. As she lay there listening to the distant barking of coyotes and going over the events of the day, she heard the approaching sound of hoof beats. Some lonely horseman was coming down the desert road. She raised herself on her elbow to listen, recognizing the sound. It was Phil's horse clattering over the little bridge, but it paused under the pepper trees. "I suppose Phil has come up to apologize," she said to herself, "but he might as well save himself the trouble. No explanation could ever explain away the fact that he was rude to us and that he gambled. I could forgive the first, but I never can forgive being so disappointed in him." A moment later, seeing no light, and evidently concluding that his visit was untimely, he turned and rode back toward the ranch. Lloyd, still leaning on her elbow, strained her ears to listen till the last footfall died away in the distance. "He'll be back in the mawning," she thought as she laid her head on the pillow. "He always comes Sunday mornings, but he'll not find us this time, because we'll be gone before he gets here." Joyce had arranged to keep August part of the next day, so that they could ride into Phoenix to church. So it happened that when Phil came up next morning, it was to find nobody but Mary in sight. Mrs. Ware had gone to the seat under the willows to read to Normand and Holland. The beehive had been brought over during Joyce's absence the day before, and placed in the shade of the bushy umbrella tree where the hammock swung, and Mary was swinging in the hammock now, with a book in her lap. It was closed over one finger to keep the place, for she was listening to the droning of the bees, breathing in the sweetness that floated in across the desert from its acres of vivid bloom, and paying more attention to the sunny, vibrant world about her than to the hymn she was learning. "What are you doing, Mary?" he called as his step upon the bridge made her look around. She held up a battered old volume of poems, and moved over in the hammock to make room for him beside her. "I'm learning a hymn. That's the way we always earned our missionary money back in Kansas. I'm going to Sunday school with Hazel and George this afternoon in the surrey over to the schoolhouse. Her uncle has one there. I didn't have any pennies to take, so mamma said I could begin learning hymns again, as I used to do back home." As usual, Mary rattled on, scarcely pausing to take breath or give her listener a chance to make reply. "This isn't one of the singing hymns, the kind they have in church. It's by Isaac Watts. I like it because it's about bees, and it's so easy to say. 'How doth the little busy bee improve each shining hour, and gather honey all the day from every opening flower.' Joyce picked it out for me and said that she guessed that Isaac Watts must have gone to the school of the bees himself. and that was where he learned that Satan finds some mischief still for idle hands to do. The bees hate idle hands, you know. That's the drones. And although they are patient with them longer than you'd suppose they'd be, it always ends in their stinging the drones to death. And Lloyd said it was a pity that some other people she knew, not 1,000 miles away, couldn't go to school to the bees and learn that about Satan's finding mischief for idle hands to do. And Joyce said yes, it was, for it was too bad for such a fine fellow to get into trouble just because he was a drone, and had no ambition to make anything of himself. And I asked them who they meant, but they just laughed at each other and wouldn't tell me. I don't see why big girls always want to be so mysterious about things and act as if they had secrets. Do you?" "No, indeed," answered Phil in his most sympathetic manner. He stooped and picked a long blade of grass at his feet. "And Joyce said that if Alaka had gone to school to the bees, he wouldn't have lost his eyes. And Lloyd said that if somebody kept on, he would lose at least his turquoises. When I asked her what she meant, she said, oh, she was just thinking of what Mr. Ellestad told at the picnic, that the Indians thought the turquoises were their most precious stones because they stole their color from the sky, and she called turquoise the friendship stone because it was true blue." Phil began whistling softly as he pulled the blade of grass back and forth between his fingers. "So they think that somebody is like Alaka, do they?" he asked presently, "in danger of losing his turquoises, his friendship stones? Well, I can imagine instances when that would be as bad for Alaka as losing his eyes." Phil had walked up to the Wigwam more buoyantly than usual that morning. He knew that he owed the girls an apology for not meeting them as he had promised, and he was prepared to make it so penitently and gracefully that he was sure that they would accept his excuses without a question. The big roll of bills in his pocket, which he had won by a lucky turn of the wheel, did not lie heavy on his conscience at all. It rather added to his buoyancy of spirit, for it was so large that it would enable him to do several things he had long wished to do. Because of it, too, he had come up to plan another picnic, this time an excursion to Paradise Valley on the other side of Camelback. But Mary's report of the conversation, which had puzzled her, gave him an uncomfortable feeling. He could not fail to understand its meaning. Evidently the girls knew what had detained him in town, and were displeased with him. "Oh, aren't you going to stay for dinner?" asked Mary, as he slowly rose and stretched himself. "It's Sunday, you know, and we always expect you on Sunday." "No, thank you," he answered, yawning. "I've changed my programme to day." "Aren't you coming back this afternoon?" she asked, anxiously. "They'll all be home then." He studied the distant buttes a moment before he answered, then squared back his shoulders in a decided way, settling his hat firmly on his head. "No," he answered, finally. "I promised a fellow I met in town at the hotel the other day that I'd ride over and see him soon. He has a camp over on the other side of a hole in the rock, with an old duffer that's out here for rheumatism. I took a fancy to the fellow the minute I saw him, and it turns out that he's the cousin of a boy I knew at military school. It's funny the way you run across people that way out here." One of Phil's greatest charms to Mary was the deferential way he had of talking to her as if she were his age, and taking the trouble to explain his actions. Now, as he turned away with a pleasant good morning, it was with as polite a lifting of his hat as if she had been 19 instead of 9. She watched him swing down the road with his quick military step, never dreaming in her unsuspecting little heart that he was the mysterious person who, the girls wished, could learn about Satan and the work he finds for idle hands. Nor did she dream that the words she had so innocently repeated were still sounding in his ears. "If somebody keeps on, he'll at least lose his turquoises. It's the friendship stone, true blue."
End of chapter 14. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 15 of The Little Colonel in Arizona. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Little Colonel in Arizona by Annie Fellows Johnston. Chapter 15. Lost on the Desert. If Washington had not lost a shoe on the way home from church, and if Joyce had not been seized with a violent headache that sent her to bed with a bandage over her eyes, the day would have ended far differently for Lloyd. The afternoon went by quickly, for lulled by the drowsy hum of the bees, she had fallen asleep in the hammock under the umbrella tree, and slept a long time. Then supper was earlier than usual, as Jack wanted his before starting to the ranch. Chris, the Mexican, was taking a holiday, and had offered Jack a quarter to do the milking for him that evening. Holland strolled down the road with him, since the lost horseshoe prevented him taking the ride he had expected to enjoy. Scarcely were they out of sight when an old buggy rattled up from the other direction, bringing a woman and her two little girls from a neighboring ranch for an evening visit. Lloyd, who was on her way to the tent to see if she could do anything for Joyce's comfort, heard a voice which she recognized as Mrs. Shaw's as the woman introduced herself to Mrs. Ware. "I've been planning to get over here ever since you came," she began, "and specially since I got acquainted with your daughter over them bees. But 'pears like there's nothing in life on week days but work. So this evening, when my little girls begged to come over and see your little girl, says I to myself, it's now or never, and I just hitched up and came." "Oh, deah!" sighed Lloyd. "I don't want to spend the whole evening listening to that tiahsome woman. The boys are gone, and Joyce's head aches too bad for her to talk. I don't know what to do." She stepped softly into the tent, insisting on rubbing Joyce's head, or doing something to make her more comfortable. But Joyce sent her away, saying that the pain was growing less, and that she didn't want her to stay shut up in the tent that smelled so strongly of the camphor she had spilled. Lloyd turned away and wandered down the pasture bars, where she stood looking over toward the west. The sun was dropping out of sight. For the first time since she had come to the Wigwam, she felt lonesome. She was so full of life after her long sleep, so fresh and wide awake, that she looked around her restlessly, wishing that something exciting would happen. She was in the mood to enjoy an adventure of some kind, no matter what. While she stood there, her pony, who had often been coaxed up to the bars for sugar, now came up through curiosity, evidently wondering at her silence. "Come on, old boy," she said, reaching through the bars to grasp the rope that trailed from his neck. "You've settled it. We'll go off and have a ride togethah." With some difficulty she saddled him herself, and then, because she did not want to disturb Joyce by going back to the tent to change her white dress for her divided skirt, she mounted as if the cross saddle were a side saddle, and rode slowly out of the yard, bareheaded. Mrs. Ware fluttered her handkerchief in response to the wave of Lloyd's hand, and looked after her as she took the road to the ranch. "She's going to see Mrs. Lee," she thought, and then turned her attention to her talkative visitor. It was merely from force of habit that Lloyd had taken the ranch road. She was in sight of the camp before she became aware of where the pony was carrying her. Then she turned abruptly, hardly knowing why she did so. Phil was at the ranch. She would not have him think that she had gone down with the hope of seeing him. She did not put the thought into words, but that is what influenced her to turn. In front of her, Camelback Mountain loomed up, looking larger and more lifelike than usual, with the reflected light of the sunset lying rosy red on its summit. She knew that there is something extremely deceptive in the clear Arizona atmosphere,
and had been told that the distance to the mountain was over 5 miles. But it was hard to believe. It looked so near that she was sure that she could reach it in a few minutes' brisk ride, that she could easily go that far and back before daylight was entirely gone. An old game that she had played at the Cuckoo's Nest sent a verse floating idly through her memory. "How many miles to Barley bright? 70. Can I get there by candlelight? Yes, if your legs are long and light. There and back again. Look out, the witches will catch you." With somewhat of the same eerie feeling that had affected her when she joined in the game with Betty and the little Appletons, she turned the pony into the narrow trail that led across the sand, in and out among the sagebrush. Later, those same gray bushes might look startlingly like witches reaching up out of the gloaming. "It's a good thing that your legs are long and light," she said to the pony, as she started off with a long rabbit-like lope. "And it's a good thing that you seem as much at home here as Brother Rabbit was in the brush pile when Brother Fox threw him in for stealing his butter. I'm glad it isn't old Tar Baby that I'm on. He wouldn't be used to these gopher holes, and would stumble into the first one we came to. Oh, this is glorious!" She shook back her hair as the soft orange perfumed breeze blew it about her face. Her full white sleeves fluttered out from her arms. Again she had that delightful sense of bird-like motion, of free, wild swinging through space. On and on they went, never noticing how far they had travelled or how dark it was growing, till suddenly she saw that she was not on any trail. A thick growth of stubby mesquite bushes made almost a thicket in front of her. An enormous cactus, 30 feet high, stood in her way like one of the Barley bright witches. From its thorny trunk stretched two great arms, thrown up as if to ward off her coming. Its resemblance to a human figure was uncanny, and she stood staring at it with a fascinated gaze. "It's big enough to be the camel driver of the Camel in the Mountain," she said in a half whisper to the pony. Then, looking on toward the mountain, she realized that she had to strain her eyes to see it through the rapidly gathering gloom. Night had fallen suddenly, and the mountain seemed farther away than when she started. "Oh, it will be black night before we get home," she thought, turning in nervous haste. Then a new trouble confronted her. She was facing a dim, trackless wilderness, and she did not know how to get home. She had kept the mountain steadily in view as she rode toward it, but now she realized that it was so large that she could easily do that and still at the same time go far out of her course. "You'll have to find the way home," she said helplessly to the pony, failing to remember that the Wigwam pasture had been his home for only a few weeks, and that, left to himself, he would go directly to his native ranch. In a few minutes Lloyd found herself carried along a narrow road, not more than a wagon track. While she knew that she had never been over it before, it was some comfort to find that she was on a human thoroughfare, and not lost among the tracks of wandering coyotes and jackrabbits. The pony, feeling that he was headed toward his own home, went willingly enough, and Lloyd began to enjoy her adventure. "How exciting it will sound back in that tame little valley," she thought. "Lost in the desert. I'll give the girls such a thrilling description of it that they feel cold chills running up and down their spines. It's a wonder that the cold chills don't run up and down me. But I'm not one bit afraid now. This road is bound to lead to somebody's house, and everybody is so friendly out here in the West that whoever finds me will take me home." The pony swung along a few rods farther, then, startled by an owl rising suddenly out of the wayside bushes with a heavy flopping of wings, jumped sideways with such a start that Lloyd was almost thrown from her seat. It was an insecure one at best, and she was about to throw her foot over into the other stirrup, when a forward plunge sent the pony into a gopher hole, and Lloyd over his head. When she picked herself up from the road and looked dizzily around, she gave a little gasp of horror. The pony, freed of his burden, and spurred on by his fright, was clattering down the road as fast as his feet could carry him, and she was left helpless in what seemed to her the very heart of the great desolate desert. She stood motionless till the last faint thud of the pony's hoofs died away down the road. Then she looked around her and shivered. The possibility of the pony's not going straight to the wigwam had not yet occurred to her, but she felt that under any circumstances she was doomed to stay in the desert until morning. They would be badly frightened at the wigwam, and would rouse the ranch to send out a searching party. But they might as well look for a needle in a haystack as to make an attempt to find her in the darkness. She did not know where she was herself. She was within a stone's throw of one of the butts, of which one she could not tell. She stood peering around her through the twilight with eager, dilated eyes. A twig crackled near her, trampled underfoot by some little wild creature, as startled as she. The desert had seemed so still before, but now it was full of strange whisperings and rustlings. Remembering what Jack had told her when he showed her the nest shared by snakes and owls, she dared not sit down for fear some snake should come crawling out of the hole from which the owl had flown. She felt that it would be useless to walk on, since every step might be carrying her farther away from the wigwam. How long she stood there in the road she could not tell, but presently it seemed to her that it was growing lighter. She could see the outlines of the butte more distinctly, and the sky behind it was growing gradually luminous. Then she remembered that the moon would be up in a little while, and her courage came back as she stood and waited. When its round, familiar face came peeping up over the horizon, she felt as if an old friend were smiling at her. "I'm nearly as glad to see you as if you were one of the family," she said aloud, with a little sob in her throat. The feeling that this was the same moon that had looked down on her through the locusts all her life, and had even peeped through the windows and seen Mom Beck rocking her to sleep in her baby days, gave her a sense of companionship that was wonderfully comforting. It was tiresome standing in the road, and as she dared not sit down and risk finding snakes, she decided to climb up the side of the butte and look out over the country. Maybe she might see the light from some ranch house. At least on its rocky slope she would be freer from snakes than down among the bushes and the owls' nests. Scrambling over a ledge of rock, she stumbled upon a pile of tin cans and broken bottles, which told of many past picnic parties near that spot. A little higher up she clasped her hands with a cry of pleased recognition. She was at the beginning of the great hole that led through the rock. Only 2 nights before she had sat on that very boulder and spread olives out of a bottle with a hat pin. There were their own sardine cans, and the fragments of the teacup Hazel had dropped. A mound of ashes and some charred sticks marked the spot where the camp fire had blazed. She looked around, wondering if by some happy chance Joe could have left any matches. A brilliant idea had come to her of lighting a bonfire. She knew that it could be seen from the ranch, and would draw attention to her at once. A long search failed to show any stray matches, and she wondered if she could find flint among the rocks, or how long it would take to get fire by rubbing 2 sticks together. Some of the gruesome tales of Apache warfare that had been told around the fire came back to her as she stood looking at the ashes, but she resolutely turned her thoughts away from them to the Indian school she had seen the day before.
It was wonderfully comforting to think of that little Indian girl at the piano, patiently practising her five-finger exercises, and of the Indian boy in the brass-buttoned uniform ploughing in the fields. It made them seem so civilized and tame. The time of tomahawks and tortures was long past, she assured herself, and there was not nearly so much to fear from the peaceful Pimas and Maricopas as there was sometimes from the negroes at home. So, quieting herself with such assurances, she climbed up to a comfortable seat on a rock where she could lean back against the cave-like wall, and sat looking out through the great hole, as the moon rose higher and higher in the heavens. Half an hour slipped by in intense silence. Then her heart gave a thump of terror, so loud that she heard the beating distinctly. There was a fierce, hot roaring in her ears. Down at the foot of the butte, going swiftly along with moccasin tread, was a stalwart Indian. Not one of the peaceful Pimas she had been accustomed to seeing, but a cruel-mouthed, eagle-eyed Apache. At least he looked like the pictures she had seen of Apaches. He had a lariat in his hand, and he stooped several times to examine the tracks ahead of him, as if following a trail. Instantly there flashed into Lloyd's mind what Mrs. Lee had told them about the Indians allowing their ponies to run loose on the desert. Sometimes the settlers' children used to catch them and keep them all day to ride. But woe be it, she said, if the owner tracked his pony to a settler's house before it was turned loose. He always took his revenge. Lloyd was sure that this was what the Indian was after, as she noticed the lariat and the way his keen eyes followed the trail. She almost held her breath as she waited for him to pass on. But he did not pass. Throwing up his head, he looked all around, and then, leaving the trail, started swiftly up the butte toward her. Almost frozen with fear, Lloyd drew back into the shadow, and, rolling over the ledge, drew herself into as small a space as possible, crouching down to hide her white dress. Through a crevice between the rocks she watched his approach with wide, terrified gaze, sure that some savage instinct, like a bloodhound's sense of smell, had warned him of her presence. For an instant, as he reached the remains of the camp fire, he stood motionless, looking out across the country, silhouetted darkly against the sky, like the head on the leather cushion she was taking home to her grandfather, she thought, or rather that she had intended to take. Maybe she would never live to see her home again. She crouched still closer against the rock, rigid, tense, scarcely breathing. With a grunt the Indian stooped and began poking around among the scraps left by the picnickers. He turned the blackened brands with his foot, then moved farther along, attracted by the gleam of a bit of broken bottle. Evidently the coyotes had been there before him, for not a scrap was left of sandwiches or chicken bones. But like the coyotes he knew from past experiences that it was profitable to prowl where picnics were almost weekly occurrences. The gleam of something steely and bright caught his eye. Lloyd saw the object flash in the moonlight as he picked it up. It was the carving knife Joe had dropped in his excitement when he found the lucky cuts on his forefingers. With another grunt he turned it this way and that, examined the handle and tried the edge, and then looked stealthily around. Lloyd closed her eyes, lest the very intensity of their gaze should draw him to her hiding place. She knew that another step or two would bring him to higher ground where he could look over the ledge and see her. How she ever lived through the moments that followed she never knew. It seemed to her that her heart had stopped beating, and she was growing clammy and faint. It could not have been more than a few minutes, but it seemed hours to her, when, the suspense growing unbearable, she opened her eyes and peered fearfully through the crack again. He had disappeared. Trembling so that she could scarcely stand, she ventured little by little to raise herself until she could look over the rock. Then she saw him moving leisurely down the path at the foot of the butte. In a moment more he had reached the road, and striding along he grew smaller and smaller to her sight till he disappeared among the dark patches of sagebrush. Lloyd sank limply down among the rocks again, so exhausted by the nervous strain that the tears began to come. The night was passing like a hideous dream. Half an hour went by. She could hear the distant barking of coyotes, and a nervous dread took possession of her, a fear that their long, gaunt forms might come sneaking up the path after a while in search of other picnic leavings. She eyed the swaying shadows apprehensively. Presently, as she sat and watched, tense and alert, she saw some one coming along the wagon track far below. He was on horseback and riding slowly, as if enjoying the calm beauty of the night. She could hear him whistling. As he reached the foot of the butte, the whistling changed to singing. The full, strong voice that rang out on the death-like stillness was wonderfully rich and sweet. "From the desert I come to thee." It was the Bedouin song. Lloyd listened wonderingly, her lips half open. Was this part of the dream? She asked herself. Part of the strange, unreal night? That was certainly Phil's voice, and yet it was past belief that he should be riding by this out-of-the-way place at such an hour of the night. But there was no mistaking the voice, nor the song that had been haunting her memory for the last 2 days. "Till the sun grows cold and the stars are old." Lloyd hesitated no longer. Scrambling up from the rocks, she went running down the steep path, calling at the top of her voice, "Phil, oh, Phil, wait!" It was Phil's turn to think he was dreaming. Flying down the path, with her white dress fluttering behind her in the moonlight, and her long fair hair streaming loosely over her shoulder, Lloyd looked more wraith-like than human. And to be confronted by such a figure in the heart of a lonely desert was such a surprise that Phil could scarcely believe that he saw aright. A moment more, and with both her cold, trembling little hands in his big, warm ones, Lloyd was sobbing out the story of her fright. The reaction was so great when she found herself in his protecting presence that she could not keep back the tears. He swung her up into his saddle in the same brotherly way he had lifted Mary into the cart the day he found her running home from school, and proceeded to comfort her in the same joking fashion. "This is the second time that I have been called on to play the bold rescuer act. I'll begin to think soon that my mission in life is to snatch fair maidens from the bloody scalpers of the plains." Then, more gently, as he saw how hard it was for her to control herself, he spoke as he often spoke to Mary. "There, never mind, Lloyd. Don't cry. It's all right, little girl. We'll soon be home. It's only a few miles from here. It isn't as late as you think, only 8:30." Slipping his watch back into his pocket, he began to explain how he happened to be passing. He had stayed to supper at the camp, where he had gone to call on his new acquaintance, and had purposely waited for the moon to come up before starting home. He had put the rein into her hands at first, but now, taking it himself, he walked along beside her, leading the horse slowly homeward. With the greatest tact, feeling that Lloyd would gain her self-possession sooner if he did not talk to her, he began to sing again, half to himself, as if unmindful of her presence, and of the little dabs she was making at her eyes with a wet handkerchief.
Maid Elsie roams by lane and lea. It was the song that his old English nurse had sung. Cling, lang, ling, she hears her bonny bride bells ring.
When he had sung it through, Lloyd's handkerchief was no longer making hasty passes at her eyes. "I wonder what my little sister Elsie is doing to night," he said. "That song always makes me think of her." "Tell me about her," said Lloyd, who wanted a little more time to regain her composure. He understood why she asked, and began to talk, simply to divert her mind from her recent fright. But presently her eager questions showed that she was interested, and he talked on, feeling that it was good to have such an appreciative listener. He began to enjoy the reminiscences himself, and as he talked the old days seemed to draw very near, till they gave him a homesick feeling for the old place that would never welcome him again. It had gone to strangers, he told her, and Aunt Patricia was dead. "Poor old Aunt Patricia," he added, after laughing over one of the pranks they had played on her. "She never did understand boys. We tried her patience terribly. She did the best she could for us, but I've often thought how different it would have been if my mother had lived. I had a letter from Daddy to day in answer to the one I wrote about leaving school. It broke me all up, made me think of the time when I was a little fellow, and he rocked me to sleep one night when I had been naughty, and explained why I ought to be a good boy. It almost made me wish I could be a little kid again, and curl up in his arms and tell him I was sorry, and would turn over a new leaf." Lloyd liked the affectionate, almost wistful way in which he spoke of his father as Daddy. Whatever indignation she had felt toward him was wiped away by those confidences, and when he apologized presently in his most winning way for not keeping his engagement, and told her frankly what had prevented, she liked him better than she had done before. She wondered how it could be so, but she felt now that she knew him as well as Malcolm or Rob, and that their friendship was not the growth of a few weeks, but that it reached back to the very beginning of things. "You can't imagine what a fascination there is in seeing that roulette wheel whirl around," he said. "But I'm done with that now. Daddy's letter settled the question, and even if that hadn't come, I would have stopped. I don't want to lose my precious turquoises, my friendship stones," he added meaningly. "I know how you and Joyce feel about it. Look at old Alaka's eyes twinkling up there over Camelback. They seem to know that I have heeded their warning." Presently, as they went along, he glanced up at her with a smile. "Do you know," he said, "you look just as you did the first time I saw you, as you rode up to the gate at Locust, all in white and on a black horse. Maybe having your hair hanging loose, as you did then, makes me think so. I never imagined then that I'd ever see you again, much less find you away out here on the desert." "It is queah," answered Lloyd. "I thought I must be dreaming when I heard you sing 'From the desert I come to thee.'" "And I certainly thought I was dreaming," answered Phil, "when in answer to my call you appeared all in white. You could have knocked me down with a feather for an instant. I was startled. Then I thanked my lucky stars that led me your way." He began again humming the Bedouin song. Lloyd, looking out across the wide moonlighted desert and up the twinkling stars, wondered if it was fate that had brought him to her rescue, if it could be possible that through him was to come the happiness written for her in the stars. "There's the wigwam light," said Phil presently, pausing in his song to point out it to her. "We're almost there. I'll never forget this adventure till—" He took up the refrain again, smiling into her eyes as he hummed it. The refrain was to ring through Lloyd's memory for many a year to come, whenever she thought of this ride across the moonlighted desert. "Till the sun grows cold and the stars are old, and the leaves of the judgment book unfold." End of chapter 15, read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 16 of The Little Colonel in Arizona. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Little Colonel in Arizona by Annie Fellows Johnston. Chapter 16. Back to Dixie. There was another mark on the kitchen calendar now. Not a red star betokening some happy event to come, but a deep black border drawn all around the date on which Lloyd's visit was to end. The heavy black lines marked the time as only a few days distant. It was Saturday again, a week after the excursion to the Indian school. Joyce had gone down to the ranch for Mr. Armond to criticize the drawings which he had made since the last lesson, and Lloyd, on the seat under the willows, was waiting for Phil. He was to come at 4 and ride over to one of the neighboring orange groves with her. She had a book in her hand, but she was not reading. She was listening to the water gurgle through the little water gate into the lateral, and thinking of all that had happened during her visit, especially since the night she was lost on the desert and Phil had found her. Monday he had spent the entire day at the Wigwam, and since Joyce had forbidden him to come near the spot where the washing was in progress, he and Lloyd had brought a jar of paste and the little wicker table down to this very seat under the willows, and had mounted all her photographs in the book she had bought for the purpose. There were over 100, beginning with a view of the Wigwam and ending with the 4 laughing faces around the table on the balcony of Coffee Al's restaurant. There was Lloyd on her pony, coming back from the duck hunt, and again in the act of dropping her cherry tart. There was Mary in the hammock, watching the bees, Jack in his irrigating boots, and Holland on a burro. There were a dozen different pictures of Joyce and family groups and picnic groups, in which was represented every acquaintance Lloyd had made in Arizona. Turning the pages was like living over the pleasant days again, for they brought the scenes vividly before her. When the last picture was mounted, Phil proposed that they write an appropriate quotation under each one, so they spent another hour over that, Phil suggesting most of them, and at Lloyd's request writing the inscriptions himself in his strong, dashing hand. Some of his apt phrases and clever parodies seemed really brilliant to Lloyd, and they had laughed and joked over them in a way that had ripened their friendship as weeks of ordinary intercourse would not have done. "Do you know," he said when the last inscription was written, "I've kept count, and I'm in 25 of these pictures. You won't have much chance to forget me, will you? I haven't put my collection in a book, but I have a better reminder of this last month than all these put together." Opening the little locket that hung from his watch fob, he held it toward her, just long enough for her to catch a glimpse of her own face within it. Then, closing the locket with a snap, he put the fob back in its place. It was a picture he had taken of her one day as she sat on this same seat under the willows, watching Aunt Emily braid an Indian basket. He had cut out a tiny circle containing her head from the rest of the group, just the size to fit in the locket. Lloyd, leaning forward unsuspectingly to look at it, was so surprised at seeing her own picture that a deep blush stole slowly over her face, and she drew back in confusion, not knowing what to say. If he had asked her permission to put her picture in his locket, she would have refused as decidedly as she had refused Malcolm the tip of a curl to carry in his watch. But Phil had not asked for anything, had not said a word to which she could reply as she had replied to Malcolm. He had showed her the locket in the same matter-of-course way that Rob had showed her the 4-leafed clover which he carried. Yet deep down in her heart she knew that there was a difference. She knew that her father would not like Phil
to have her picture in his locket, but she did not know how to tell him so. It was only an instant that she sat in shy, embarrassed silence, with her heart in a flutter, and her eyes fastened on the book of photographs which she was fingering nervously. Then Jack came out with a pitcher of lemonade, and the opportunity to speak passed. She hadn't the courage to bring up the subject afterward. "Phil might think that I think that it means more than it does," she told herself. "He wears the picture just as he would Elsie's, and if I tell him that I don't want him to, he'll think that I think that he cares for me the way that Malcolm does. I don't suppose that it really makes any difference whether he has it in his locket or not." He did not mention it again, but it did make a difference. The consciousness of it embarrassed her whenever she met his eyes. She wondered if Joyce noticed. Tuesday he came again, and read aloud all morning while they ironed. Wednesday he spent the day without bringing anything as an excuse. Thursday he rode with them over to the Indian reservation. Her pony had been brought back to her the day after it ran away. When he left them at the wigwam that evening, he said that he would not be back the next day, as he had to go to Phoenix, but that he would be up Saturday afternoon to ride with Lloyd to the orange grove, while Joyce took her drawing lesson. It was of all this that Lloyd was thinking now, as she sat under the willows. And she was thinking, too, of the tale Mrs. Walton told her of the three weavers, the tale that had been the cause of the Shadow Club turning itself into the Order of Hildegarde. Mrs. Walton had spoken truly when she said that little girls begin very early sometimes to dream about that far-away land of romance. Lloyd's dreams might not have begun so soon, perhaps, had it not been for the meetings of the Shadow Club at boarding school, when Ida Shane fired their imagination with the stories of Daisy Dale and the Heiress of Dorn, and made Lloyd the bearer of her letter to her Edwardo. The unhappy ending of Ida's romance had been a grave warning to Lloyd, and the story of Hildegarde in the Three Weavers was often in her thoughts. Part of it floated through her memory now, as she realized with a start how large a place Phil had occupied in her thoughts the last week. "Hildegarde worked on, true to her promise, but there came a time when a face shone across her mirror, so noble and fair that she started back in a flutter. 'Oh, surely 'tis he,' she whispered to her father. 'His eyes are so blue they fill all my dreams.' But old Hildgardmar answered her, 'Does he measure up to the standard set by the sterling yardstick for a prince to be?'" "That's just what Papa Jack would ask," mused Lloyd. "And he'd say that little girls outgrow their ideals as they do their dresses, and that if I'm not careful, that I'll make the same mistake that Hertha and Huberta did. Besides, there's my New Year's promise." For a moment she ceased to hear the gurgle of the water, and heard instead the ticking of the clock in the long drawing room at Locust, as she and Papa Jack kept watch beside the embers, waiting for the old year to die and the new one to dawn. And in the solemn hush she heard her own voice repeating Hildegarde's promise. "You may trust me, father. I will not cut the golden warp from out the loom until I, a woman grown, have woven such a web as thou thyself shalt say is worthy of a prince's wearing." A woman grown, and she was not yet quite 14. "I'll not be the only one of all the Lloyds that can't be trusted to keep a promise," she said aloud, with a proud lifting of the head. Resolutely shaking herself free from the day dreaming that had been so pleasant, she picked up her book and started to the house. Listening to Aunt Emily's conversation over her stocking darning about the commonplace happenings of the household was not half so entertaining
as letting her thoughts stray back to the moonlight ride, to the smile in Phil's eyes as he showed her the locket, or the sound of his voice as he sang, "From the desert I come to thee." There were a dozen such memories so pleasant to dwell upon that a girl of less will power would not have pushed them aside. Even Lloyd found it difficult to do. "It's like trying to drive away a flock of cherry birds," she thought. "They keep coming back no matter how often you say shoo. But I won't let them stay." Such a resolution was easier to make than to keep, especially as she was expecting to see Phil ride up to the door at any moment. But the time set for his coming passed, and when a step on the bridge made her glance up, it was Joyce she saw, walking along slowly. Usually she danced in after her lesson hour with Mr. Armand in the gayest of spirits. To-day it was apparent that she was the bearer of bad news. "Oh, mamma," she began, dropping her sketches on the table, and fumbling to find her hat pin. "They're all so worried down at the ranch over Phil. Mrs. Lee says he went to town yesterday morning, expecting to be back in time for dinner, but he hasn't come yet. Joe went in on his wheel last night, and he saw him at one of those places where they play faro, and all those games, and he was so excited over his winnings that he didn't even see Joe, although he stood and watched him ever so long. This morning Mr. Ellestad went in, and he came across him wandering about the streets. He had lost not only every cent he had deposited in the bank, but he put up his horse and lost that too. He didn't have any way to get out to the ranch. He wouldn't drive out with Mr. Ellestad. He was so mortified and disgusted with himself that he said he couldn't face them all. He said his father would never trust him again, and that he had lost not only his father's confidence, but our respect and friendship. He said he was going to look for work of some kind. He didn't care what, and it didn't make any difference what became of him now. Mr. Ellestad left him at a hotel, and he felt so sorry for him that, tired as he was, he rode over to Tempe after he got home to see a friend of his who is a civil engineer. This friend is going to start on an expedition next week, surveying for some canals. Mr. Ellestad persuaded him to take Phil in his party and give him some work. Phil said he didn't intend to touch a cent of his usual monthly allowance until he had earned back all he lost. Mr. Ellestad telephoned to him from Tempe, and he is to start in a few days. Mrs. Lee says that losing everything is the best thing that could have happened to Phil. It's taught him a lesson he'll never forget, and this surveyor is just the sort of a man he ought to be with, clean and honorable and strong." As Joyce finished her excited telling with these familiar words, the color that had faded completely out of Lloyd's face rushed back again. Clean and honorable and strong. These were the standards of the yardstick that Papa Jack had given her. How far Phil had failed to measure up to the last two notches, and yet Mrs. Ware finished the unspoken sentence for her. "He is so young that I can't help feeling that, with something to keep him busy, and some one to take a helpful interest in him, he will turn out all right. He has so many fine traits. I'm sure they will prevail in the end, and that he will make a manly man after all." Joyce openly wiped away the tears that came at the thought of this ending to their happy comradeship, but Lloyd stole away to the tent to hide her face in her pillow and sob out the disappointment of her sore little heart. She would never see him again, she told herself, and they had had such good times together, and she was so sorry that he had proved so weak. Presently, as she lay there, she heard Holland come clattering up on the pony, inquiring for her. He had killed a snake. She could hear him telling his mother, and had brought it home to skin for Lloyd. It was a beautifully marked diamond back with 10 rattles, and now she could have a purse and a hatband
like some she had admired in Phoenix. Lloyd listened languidly. "An hour ago," she thought, "I would have been out there the instant I heard him call. I would have been admiring the snake and thanking him for it, and asking 100 questions about how he got it. But now, somehow, everything seems so different." She started up as he began calling her. "I wish he'd let me alone," she exclaimed impatiently. "Aunt Emily will think it strange if I don't answer, for she knows I'm out here, but I don't feel like talking to anybody or taking an interest in anything, and I don't want to go out there." The call came again. She drew back the tent flap and looked out. "I'll be there in a minute, Holland," she answered, trying to keep the impatience out of her voice. As she went over to the washstand to bathe her eyes, she brushed a magazine from the table in passing. It was the one Phil had brought up several days before to read aloud. She replaced it carefully, almost as one touches the belongings of some one who is dead. There were so many things around the tent to remind her of him. It would be almost impossible to keep him out of her thoughts. She confessed to herself that it was growing very hard to keep her Hildegarde promise. She started to whisper it as one might repeat some strengthening charm. "You may trust me, father." She stopped with a sob. This sudden ending of their happy companionship was going to shadow all the rest of her visit. As her eyes met her reflection in the little mirror hanging against the side of the tent, she lifted her head with determination and looked at it squarely. "I will stop thinking about it all the time," she said defiantly to the answering eyes. "It will spoil all my visit if I don't. I'll do the way the bees do when things get into the hive that have no right there. I'll seal it up tight as I can, and go on filling the other cells with honey, doing things that will be pleasant to remember by and by. I'll make myself take an interest in something else." The same spirit that looked from the eyes of the proud old portraits at home looked back at her now from the eyes in the mirror. That strong, indomitable spirit of her ancestors, that could rise even to the conquering of that hardest of all enemies, self, when occasion demanded it. Running out to the wood pile, where Holland impatiently awaited her, she threw herself into the interests of the hour so resolutely that she was soon absorbed in its happenings. By the time the snake was skinned and the skin tacked to the side of the house to dry, she had gained a victory that left her stronger for all her life to come. She had compelled herself to take an interest in the affairs of others when she wanted to mope and dream. Instead of an hour of selfish musing in her tent, she had had an hour of wholesome laughter and chatter outside. It would be a pleasant time to look back upon, too, she thought, complacently remembering Mary's amusing efforts to help skin the snake, and all the funny things that had been said. "Well, that hour's memory cell is filled all right," Lloyd thought. "I'll see how much more honey I can store away before I leave." There was not much more time, for Mr. Sherman came soon with the announcement that they would leave in 2 days. Numerous letters had passed between the Wigwam and the mines, so Lloyd knew what was going to happen when her father arranged for her and Joyce to spend part of one of those days in town. She knew that when they came back they would find a long rustic arbor built in the rear of the tents, a rough shack of cottonwood poles supporting a thatch of bamboo and palm leaves. Underneath would be a dozen or more hives, humming with thousands of golden-banded bees. And for all the rest of their little lives, these bees would spend their shining hours in helping Joyce on toward easier times and the city of her desire. Something else happened that day while they were in town.
Phil made his last visit before starting away with the surveying party. Nobody knew what passed between him and Aunt Emily in the old Wigwam sitting room, but he came out from the interview smiling, so full of hope and purpose that her whispered Godspeed seemed already to have found an answer. She told the girls afterward a little of their conversation. His ambition was aroused at last, she said. He was going to work hard all summer, and in the fall go back to school. Not the military academy, but a college where he could take the technical course this friend of Mr. Ellestad recommended. Phil admired this man immensely, and she was sure that his influence would be exceedingly helpful. She was sure, too, that he would be all right now, and he had promised to write to her every week. As Phil came out of the Wigwam, he heard Mary's voice in a sort of happy little chant, as she watched the settling of the bees in their new home. She had heard nothing of Phil's troubles, and did not know that he was going away until he told her. "I want you to tell Lloyd and Joyce something for me," he said. "Try to remember just these words, please. Tell them that I said, 'Alaka has lost his precious turquoises, but he will win them back again some day.' Can you remember to say just that?" Mary nodded gravely. "Yes," she said, "I'll tell them." Then her lip trembled. "But I don't want you to go away," she exclaimed, the tears beginning to come. "Aren't you ever coming back?" "Not for a long time," he answered, looking away toward old Camelback. "Not till I have learned the lesson that you told me about the first time I saw you that day on the train, to be inflexible. When I'm strong enough to keep stiff in the face of any temptation, then I'll come back. Good-bye, little vicar." Stooping, he kissed her gently on each plump cheek, and turned hastily away. She watched him go off down the road through a blur of tears. Then she rubbed her sleeve across her eyes. He had turned to look back, and seeing the disconsolate little figure gazing after him, waved his hat. There was something so cheery and hopeful in the swing he gave it, that Mary smiled through her tears, and answered with an energetic fluttering of her white sunbonnet, swung high by its one string. Joy's delight on her return, when she found the long row of hives, was something good to see. She could hardly speak at first, and walked from one hive to another, touching each as she passed, as if to assure herself that it was really there, and really hers. "Joyce is so bewildered by her good fortune that she is almost beside herself," said Holland, when he had watched her start on her third round of inspection. "That's the truth," laughed Joyce, turning to face Lloyd and her father. "I'm so happy that I don't know what I'm doing, and I can't begin to thank you properly till I've settled down a little." There was no need of spoken thanks when her face was so eloquent. Even the mistakes she made in setting the supper table spoke for her. In her excitement she gave Mr. Sherman 2 forks and no knife, and Lloyd 3 spoons and no fork. She made the coffee in the teapot and put the butter in a pickle dish. Only Mary's warning cry saved her from skimming the cream into the syrup pitcher, and she sugared everything she cooked instead of salting it. "Oh, I'm sorry," she cried when her mistakes were discovered. "But if you were as happy as I am, you'd go around with your head in the clouds, too." After supper she said to Mr. Sherman, as they walked out to the hives again, "You see, I've been thinking all day how much I'm going to miss Lloyd, and what a road of the loving heart she's left behind her on this visit. We've enjoyed every minute of it, and we'll talk of the things she's said and done for months. Then I came home to find that she's left not only a road behind her, but one that will reach through all the years ahead, a road that will lead straight through to what I have set my heart on doing. I'm going into bee culture,
with all my might and main now, and make a fortune out of it. There'll be time enough after that to carry out my other plans. To think," she added, as Lloyd joined them, "when I first came to the Wigwam, I was so lonesome and discontented that I wanted to die. Now I wouldn't change places with any other girl in the universe." "Not even with me?" cried Lloyd in surprise, thinking of all she had and all that she had done. "No, not even with you," answered Joyce, quoting softly, "For me the desert holds more than kings' houses could offer." The last 2 days of Lloyd's visit went by in a whirl. As she drove away with her father in the open carriage that had been sent out of town for them, she stood up to look back and wave her handkerchief to the little group under the pepper trees, as long as the Wigwam was in sight. Then she kept turning to look back at old Camelback Mountain, until it too faded from sight in the fading day. Then she settled down beside her father and looked up at him with a satisfied smile. "Somehow I feel as if my visit is ending like the good old fairy tales. They all lived happily evah aftah. Joyce is so happy over the bees and Mr. Armond's lessons. Aunt Emily is lots bettah. The boys have so much to hope for since you promised to help Holland to get into the Navy, and make a place for Jack at the mines. As for Mary, she's so blissful over the prospect of a visit to Locust next yeah that she can't talk of anything else."
"And what about my little Hildegarde?" asked Mr. Sherman. "Did the visit do anything for her?"
"Yes," said Lloyd, growing grave as the name Hildegarde recalled the promise that had been so hard to keep, and the victory she had won over herself the day she turned away from her day dreams and her disappointment to interest herself in other things. She felt that the bees had shown her a road to happiness that would lead her out of many a trouble in the years to come. She had only to follow their example, seal up whatever had no right in her life's hive, or whatever was spoiling her happiness, and fill the days with other interests. "Oh, I'm lots wiser than when I came," she said aloud. "I've learned to make pies and coffee, and to iron, and to weave Indian baskets."
"Is that the height of your ambition?" was the teasing reply. "You don't soar as high as Joyce and Betty."
"Oh, Papa Jack, I know you'll be disappointed in me, but honestly, I can't help it. I haven't any big ambitions. Seems to me I'd be contented always just to be your deah little daughtah, and not do any more than just gathah up each day's honey as it comes, and lay up a hive full of sweet memories for myself and other people."
"That suits me exactly," he answered with an approving nod. "Contented people are the most comfortable sort to live with, and such an ambition as yours will do more good in your little corner of the world than all the books you could write or pictures you could paint." The engine was steaming on the track when they drove up to the station. Waffles, the coloured man, whom Mr. Robson had brought with him as a cook, hung over the railing of the rear platform, whistling "Going Back to Dixie."
"How good that sounds!" exclaimed Lloyd, as her father helped her up the steps. "Now that we are really headed for home, I can hardly wait to get back to the Valley and tell mothah and Betty about my visit. I don't believe anybody in the whole world has as many good times to remembah as I have, or as many good times to look forward to," she added later, when, with a mighty snorting and puffing, the engine steamed slowly out of the station and started on its long homeward journey. As they rumbled on, she began picturing her arrival, the welcome at the station, and her meeting with her mother and Betty and the Walton girls. How much she had to tell them all,
and how many delightful meetings she would have with the club. Her birthday was only 2 months away. Then the locusts would be white with bloom, and after that vacation. With the coming of summer time to the valley would come Rob to measure with her at the measuring tree, to play tennis, and to share whatever the long summer days held in store. With a vague sense that all sorts of pleasantness awaited her there, her thoughts turned eagerly toward Kentucky. Even the car wheels seemed to creak in pleased anticipation, and keep time to the tune she hummed half under her breath. My heart turns back to Dixie, and I must go. The end. End of chapter 16, and end of the book, The Little Colonel in Arizona, by Annie Fellows Johnston. Read by Lars Rolander. Thank you very much for listening.